Commission after 10:30 unless the commission by majority vote decides to continue reviewing items. Any decision that's reached by the Planning Commission tonight may be appealed to the City Council. Appeals must be filed with the city clerk within 15 calendar days following the Planning Commission meeting. With that, we will move on to the next item, which is comments from the public. These are comments on any item not appearing on the agenda. Under state law, matters presented under this item cannot be discussed or acted upon by the Planning Commission at this time. If you have an item on the agenda, you can do it at the appropriate time when that agenda comes up. And with that, Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Felder. Ken Brown, 1396 Lubeck Street in the city of Sonoma. My wife's company, Sonoma Patient Group, has started their delivery business here in the city of Sonoma. This is a very positive step for the city to take. I'll hand some flyers. Take a look. It's the way to shop. It's good to see you and Larry up there, Steve.
Thank you, Ken. Anyone else?
Hi, Fred Allebach, 19550 8th Street East. I sent an unsolicited comment to the Planning Commission today, and as you probably know, I'm a member of the Sonoma Valley Housing Group. I'm an affordable housing advocate for area median income people here in Sonoma, and so a lot of my comment was based on this particular book here called The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. And so this is a book that's kind of shocking when we've been talking about housing in terms of other sort of terms, when you see, the underlying reason of why certain neighborhoods are the way they are. I realize that housing is a complicated issue and there's a lot to it. And today I was also at the Sustainable Sonoma meeting as an alternate to their council, and they've adopted housing as their first main thing. And so I just wanted to come up and say that I'm somebody who's really pushing for an inclusive, integrated community by whatever ways that we can get it and the best ways that we can. And I would hope that we define affordable housing by what's affordable to the bulk of the people who are in the county, which is the area median income people, which is really actually the majority of people in the county, because the ultra high earners pull the median point up higher than it really is for 50% of the people. So the median is not really that. But anyhow, I've said all this stuff over and over again, and I'm probably going to keep on saying it. And I'm just hoping that things will go in a way that's more inclusive than we see on the ground today. And also, I'd like to say that it's really fun to see some of my friends and associates on the Planning Commission now. It's a new era in Sonoma, and so I'm happy to see it.
Amen, brother.
And Fred, just for your information, your letter was put into the packet.
Thank you.
Hi there. My name is Reese Wheatley, and I live on Robinson Road in the Donald Verano area. As I'm sure you're aware, the county's spring-specific plan has proposed a radical rezoning to our area to take it from a rural, it's a hard one for me, residential community to the highest density housing included in that plan. There's little question that the infrastructure built 50 and 60 years ago for rural use will not be compatible with the proposed project. We're hoping that this will be addressed more adequately in the upcoming environmental report. And I do realize that your position, your jurisdiction is city limits, and this information will certainly affect past the county line and be of interest to the city in future development. The visual is a depiction of the dead-end streets and traffic choke points in the Donald Street neighborhood. The red dots here, the red dots at the end of the green marked streets represent dead-end streets. There are 11. There's no exit to the north and no exit to the east. Policy SC2F from the Spring Specific Plan states the following: prohibit cul-de-sac dead-end streets except where the existing conditions require them. The reason for this is that dead-end streets restrict traffic flow and do not allow for alternative entry and exit options. The area was evacuated early in the last fire because it would be easy for people to become trapped in their homes with no escape. This plan would make it much worse, even life-threatening. And as I'm sure you are aware, 3 of the streets dead end into CAL FIRE's designated high fire zone areas. The zoning that allows 3-story, high-density buildings creates major daily traffic choke points at Donald Street, Robinson, Verano and Robinson, and the entry to Highway 12 from Donald Street. Left turns from Donald onto Highway 12 would be impossible. Left turns from Highway 12 would back up Highway 12 through the Springs. The adverse effects of this plan cannot be overstated. The neighborhood of Donald recognizes the need for additional community housing and are not opposing the future development. We believe that Donald Street was hastily incorporated into the plan as a target of development opportunity rather than a well-thought-out expansion of available housing. We suggest the neighborhood growth for Donald Street that is independent of but coordinated with the objectives of the Springs-specific plan. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good evening, Commissioners. I have handouts for all of you. Should I bring them to you individually or give them? Okay. My name is Gary Germano, and I live at 18850 Melvin Avenue in Sonoma. Melvin Avenue is a cul-de-sac street 2 blocks east of Highway 12, and the cul-de-sac enters and exits through Donald Avenue. I'm going to just briefly go over this with you. This addition was evidently put into the Springs specific plan, which was something different than the Springs redevelopment plan, and started around 2012 to 2013. The biggest issue of the whole issue is that nobody in the neighborhood at all was noticed through the whole process, and nobody in that neighborhood had any idea that they were part of the hot springs, which was known for years to people as being up in Agua Caliente, Felder's, Boys, and partially some of El Verano, which is on the west side of the highway. So what happened was, as you can see on your first map there, that's an old Springs redevelopment map, and you could see where Donald Avenue is right next to the highway. It's written in at the bottom on the right-hand side. The next map is the Springs specific plan map from 2017, and you could see that it picked up this whole leg, which is about a half a mile in, and takes in the north side of Verano Avenue. Keep in mind, Verano Avenue separates the city from the county, so the other side of Verano Avenue, with the exception of one lot there, is all city. So you're kind of right in the edge of this issue. So this map shows they annexed that whole piece in, and no one was ever noticed at all of having their zonings changed. So this black line across the top in sort of a hoop, that just shows you that that backs up to a mountain and trees. This blue line that comes out from the highway goes down, that's Lomita Avenue, hits Verano, and goes all the way to the right to 5th Street west, is just for the sake of what it is, it's an 8-inch, 200 PSI gas main, which they notified us about that after they had the problems in San Bruno and gave everyone notices and maps. So in any case, the point of the whole issue is, so they took approximately 92 out of, the third page is the zoning changes and proposals. They took approximately 92 out of 120 units, and they rezoned them. The single-family lots are 8 units per acre. They rezoned them to multifamily lots, and there's actually 2 small empty lots. One is the 2.36 acre lot, which is upzoned to 3-story apartment zoning, 60 to 100 units per acre, right in the middle of the neighborhood, which is probably the reason this whole thing got put in there to begin with.
I'm going to have to ask you to wind up your comments, please.
Okay. So I think the biggest issue is this was all sprung on us, so to speak. The neighbors found out about it through one in January of this year. No one ever approached anyone telling them they were rezoning their properties. I don't think that's fair. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. Bill Lurtz, 650 Donald Street. And I'd just like to take you through briefly the traffic situation this will create, not only for the Donald Street area, but also for Sonoma. So it's basically the impacts on Verano and Highway 12. If you look at this map, it shows this is the 2005 peak hour traffics. This area right here currently is a level F, the highest impact level of service, basically a traffic jam. By 2035, they had projected that Arnold Street would also fall into that, and this one which starts about at Spain and extends up to the shopping plaza. That one would be existing. But then with the spring specific plan, this creates a new level of service F extending from Agua Cali or from Sierra Siesta down to Verano. So the impacts of this, when you listen to the numbers, are staggering. Currently, from the creek, which is just about this far up, here's the creek, down to Verano, the current level of traffic, and this is from the Trip Generation summer report, the current is 785 cars per day. After the Springs plan, if they choose the highest density, it will add an additional 1,117 daily trips in that area. And that affects all the people traveling from Sonoma down Verano, headed up north to Kenwood, and every place else will be affected by this. And we're concerned about that, and I think you should be as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Tom Conlon, 18850 Robinson Road. I just wanted to let you know that I sit on the Transportation Authority Citizens Advisory Council, and we got a presentation from Chris Barney recently on the traffic behavior model that's being prepared. And I had two recommendations. One was to include Sonoma Plaza in their scope of their study, and the second was to include this Donald neighborhood in the scope of the study. I got response from Chris Barney saying that they will be looking at the plaza, and I confirmed that last night with Kat Wall at the Community Service Environment Commission, and I hope that that produces good work for you guys, and if we learn more about our traffic and circulation issues, specifically right around the plaza. I don't believe that they are currently planning to do the traffic analysis that was, as you've heard, already described as an issue. So I think just pay attention to that issue. I'm going to continue to be asking for more traffic study of the county in that area. Secondarily, and you know I have spoken before you in support of affordable housing in our valley, and then specifically on several projects here in the city. I came tonight intending to speak in favor of the Saha project. I didn't realize it was on the consent calendar. I'm glad to see it's on the consent calendar. I hope it stays on the consent calendar, and I hope you approve the consent calendar. It's a good project, and we would love to have more affordable housing in the valley in general. I say me as a member of this neighborhood that's been speaking to you about the issues north of Sonoma. We just want to be sure that we don't break that neighborhood, and I think the plan as it's designed right now has raised a lot of concerns. I still have a lot of concerns myself personally. One thing in particular that I'm hoping will come out of the plan is improved bicycle circulation through that neighborhood. One proposal that I've personally made to Kyle Rabolino, the planner in charge of the Spring Specific Plan, is to improve Donald Street in particular for bicycle travel from Highway 12 to avoid bicycling through the Verano intersection at Highway 12. That's a terrible intersection for people on bicycles. I almost got creamed there the other day. It would be better if you could come through that neighborhood and potentially even open up the Fifth Street West easement the county has and bring bicycle traffic down Fifth Street on the Montini side of the street, if there were a Class 1 path in through there. So it's just a proposal. We're going to see what the plan does. That's my personal opinion. We haven't vetted this through group in North Sonoma, but I hope you'll all pay attention to this process as it goes forward. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Tom. Anyone else? Seeing none, we'll close the comment from the public. Next item is review and acceptance of the agenda. Does anyone have any changes or comments on that? Seeing none, we'll accept it as is. Item 5 is late correspondence.
We received late correspondence on item 8.1 and 8.2. It was distributed and also posted on our website.
Thank you. Item 6 is a consent calendar. All items listed on the consent calendar are considered to be routine and will be acted on by a single motion. There will be no separate discussion of these items unless members of the Planning Commission staff or public request that specific items be removed for separate action.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I'd like to remove item 6.1, special draft minutes, in order to make a correction.
Okay. And I would like to remove item 6.2, the use permit extension for the Altamira project. So that pretty much wipes out the consent calendar. So let's go to, there is no other left. Let's go to item 6.1 for a correction.
In the item 7.1 in the minutes, public hearing, it concludes that item by saying that I made a motion and then I seconded the motion. That clearly is not correct. Now, my memory doesn't serve me as to who actually made the motion, and I do recall seconding a motion, but I don't remember who made the original motion.
Okay, we'll fix that.
If I may, I think I made the motion.
Takes care of that one. So can I have a motion to approve the minutes as amended?
I would also like to make a
Okay,
correction
sorry.
or ask a question. In item 7.6, the PUD on Broadway by Traintown there. So I guess this general question, and I guess we're getting to it later in the agenda, but I thought action minutes were just supposed to be the action. Because there's sort of, on a few of these, there's sort of like for example, on 7.6, the commissioners provided feedback to the applicant in general support of the project. And so if we're going to keep things like that in, I would also like to add a sort of vague general statement about what we discussed about the scope of environmental review. Because I, in particular, wanted, I believe we were talking about initial studies and all that. And so I would either put a line like that in there or subtract the line where we talked about general support.
I think the direction we'll be heading is to not have that editorial comment about the commissioners. It's kind of an interesting thing because these are study sessions, and I know in the past there's been pages of minutes of what the commission has done in the past. So we were struggling trying to figure out what was an appropriate record, and we are required to list those people that speak.
Right.
Okay, so we'll make that as well. So do we have a motion to approve the minutes as amended?
Sorry, I have one other correction that I think should be made, and that's on item 7.3, the 4th line up from the bottom of that section. It says Commissioner Barbos accepted the motion amendment. That should say Commissioner Kelso Barnett, since this was his motion.
All right, now I'll try again. Will anybody like to make a motion to approve these minutes as amended?
So moved.
Seconded.
Roll call, please.
Commissioner Kelso Barnett.
Aye.
Commissioner O'Neill.
Yes.
Commissioner Willander.
Yes.
Chair Felder.
Yes.
Commissioner Bohar.
Aye.
Commissioner Barbos.
Yes.
Commissioner Larry Barnett.
Aye.
The motion is unanimously approved, 7-0.
We'll then move on to item 6.2, which is a request for use permit extension allowing the 48-unit affordable apartment development, Altamira, at 1269 Broadway. And I'll ask the planning director to give us a staff report, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, Commissioners. David Storr, Director of Planning and Community Services. In discussions with Mr. Abachi, we thought it would be appropriate to actually have the Planning Commission make a determination one way or the other with respect to the action that you want to take, rather than doing it through consent, which is basically the same thing, but we want to have an express direction or determination from your commission with regard to your action on the extension. That concludes my comments.
Thank you.
I will just add, under section 19.56.040 of the Sonoma Municipal Code, in case the commission is inclined to approve the recommendation of staff, the commission would have to make the determination that the permittee proceeded in good faith and has exercised due diligence in complying with the conditions in a timely manner. So that would be a part of the action.
Thank you. Questions of staff?
Per that municipal code, it says the burden of proof is on the applicant to establish that substantial evidence.
That's correct.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if I can just add to the comment and the discussion, I've been working with Saha over the last couple of months to work with their paperwork guys in reestablishing their request for the federal funding.
Thank you. Other questions of staff? Seeing none, is anyone here from the applicant that would care to speak?
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Adam Cooperman. I'm a project manager at Satellite Affordable Housing Associates. Some of you are familiar and some of you are new to me, so nice to see you here. As Mr. Storr mentioned, we have recently filed for or submitted an application for 9% competitive federal low-income housing tax credits through the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee. We are in the kind of waiting period right now where we will learn whether this project has received a tax credit reservation. Things are looking good so far, as we received a confirmation of our tax credit score and competitive tiebreaker score from the Tax Credit Allocation Committee just last week, which by our analysis puts us in a good position to receive a reservation. We have been working diligently with the city, submitted for building permits, paid a down payment for getting building permit review started. We are continuing to work with the city and aligning ourselves to be in a position to start construction very quickly after tax credit reservations are awarded and our lender and investor process is concluded as well. So things are on a good time frame to be under construction, most certainly this year, hopefully sometime in the fall. And I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone may have.
Yes.
Did you say federal tax credits?
Yes. So the way that the tax credit program works is that federal tax credits are distributed to every state, and there's a state commission that oversees the award of those tax credits. So in California, it's the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee based in Sacramento, and they oversee two different types of tax credit programs, one competitive and one non-competitive, and we are awaiting the results of this competitive round of tax credit allocation.
Have there been any changes to the federal program or cuts? I want to say recently I read something to that effect.
There have not. There was, discussion during tax reform, more in relationship to the non-competitive tax credit bond program, but those survived. And this program, which was established in the 80s, has been and continues to receive bipartisan support.
And then my final question is, was there a application made previously, or is this the first application?
No, we went through a pretty lengthy, close to 2-year process of a community process and multiple planning commission meetings.
No. I'm talking about the tax credit application.
Yeah, there was one previous tax credit application submitted, but due to the competitive nature, it was not awarded. But based on our analysis, this round is looking very good.
How many rounds can you apply? Just indefinitely until?
You can, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, Commissioner.
I've got a question actually for our planning director. Recently, the city enacted a new schedule of development fees. And have those been essentially finalized, codified?
Yes, they went into effect February the 15th.
Okay, and to the extent to which they would apply to an affordable housing project like this, given its history of application and approval, is there any retroactive effect on fees that might have been due had the laws been in effect? I guess what I'm getting at here is I wouldn't want to see this project suddenly get some new fee surprises unless it's a legal requirement that certain fees be assessed. And if that's the case, I'm wondering if the city has yet explored any kind of fee waiver program for affordable projects.
I think I can address the first part. The fees that went into effect February the 15th were with respect to submitting an application to the city to process an application like the one that Adam has presented to the city. So we are doing the full cost recovery. So if somebody was to walk through to City Hall and say, I want to do a subdivision map or a use permit, those are the fees that we modified, not the impact fees that I think you might be addressing.
I was less concerned about the impact fees, which would be kind of redundant on a project like this. More that just in terms of avoiding any surprises, is there the likelihood that there are any fees that this project is going to now generate going forward that they might not be aware of?
I don't know. I think Adam might be the better one because you've submitted your applications already. I don't believe we've had a fee increase, at least since I've been here, of submitting for your building permit processing and those kind of plan check reviews. Adam, can you address that?
We've received total building permit fee estimates, but those were based off of just some higher level anecdotal pieces of information about the project. I think that my understanding is as the project submits our construction plans and they're reviewed by the different city agencies, that's when we essentially receive a written invoice that's more specific and tailored to what we submitted, as opposed to the estimates that we received earlier on in the process. At this point, I'm not aware or necessarily concerned that we're going to be hit with any fees that we're not anticipating, but we've yet to receive our final invoice.
Well, if I might suggest to you.
Sure.
In a process of a transition like this, surprises can happen, and I would suggest strongly that at your earliest convenience, you sit down with the appropriate planning staff or building department and the rest and review the assumptions that have been made in the past. If you have anything on paper or in writing or anything like that, bring those along. I would not wait until you're ready to make your final submissions to determine whether or not there may be some unexpected increases in the fees, because while I can't sitting up here give you chapter and verse of what types of fees have increased to what extent, there was a very significant increase in the fee structure of the city, and I don't want to see you get surprised.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, the ones that I think you're referring to may be some of those like the sewer and the water. Those are the ones that I'm hearing about that have been increased, and those typically around a July 1st type of a timeline when new fees get adopted by public agencies. I'm not aware that we've got anything going into effect this year, but we can certainly work with Adam. We've been communicating over the last 60 to 90 days.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions of the applicant?
Yeah, Adam, I have two questions. The first is, when will you find out whether or not you get this federal tax credit?
I'm checking my mailbox every day.
So is it within a month or?
It's an arduous process that I'm not quite sure that it should be within a month. Typically, the allocation committee will send a letter that confirms the score that you your self score and your competitive tiebreaker that you report. They score that and confirm that it's either as you report it or they make a correction. And shortly after that, which can be weeks, usually not much more than a month, is when you'll learn whether you are receiving a reservation or not. So I'm on pins and needles right now. It should be soon, hopefully.
Okay, and the second question is, if you do not get the federal tax credit, what is the prognosis for this project?
If that were to be the case, there's another round of competitive tax credits that is due in July. So there's 2 rounds every year, one due in kind of end of February, early March, and one due end of June, early July. The benefit that this project has is that in the state's definition, the city of Sonoma is considered a rural project, which allows for a certain set aside of tax credits where what is a relatively low competitive tiebreaker ends up being a higher competitive tiebreaker for the rural category. So based on that, the committed funding that we've received from the city and the county, those are all components that help boost that score. And so we sit relatively in a comfortable space. I can only stay optimistic in that this is our round, and if it ends up not being, then we know that we have another opportunity here in just a few months from now.
Thank you.
Yep.
It would be inappropriate for me to ask what the financial impact of the tax credit is in terms of actual dollars. In other words, I don't have much clarity about what it is that's a tiebreaker or a swing dollar amount to make this thing go. I'm just curious. Could you share that?
Sure. It's basically when you apply, you apply for a certain amount of tax credits.
Mm-hmm.
When you're awarded those tax credits, you're then able to go out to a pool of investors who purchase these tax credits, and you sell them to said investor at a bidding rate that they see affordable per their accounting. That looks different for every institution who has certain requirements for what they must invest into a certain geographic region. So, right, 3 years ago, a dollar tax credit was selling for $1.15. Post 2016, that dropped significantly to anywhere from high 80 cents to $1, depending on the project and the geography. We're currently stable at about anywhere from high 90 cents until $1.05, $1.06.
And in the aggregate, how much would be the total amount of the tax credit you apply for?
Tax credits will pay close to $19 million into the project over a 10-year period.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Would anyone else from the public care to speak on this item?
Fred Allebach again, 19550 8th Street East. I met Adam at the first time that Saha came around the valley, and David Goodison and Susan Gorin introduced me to him, and I've been an advocate for this project ever since. And one of the things that I determined early on about my advocacy was that the really important point of it for me and for affordable housing was to maintain the high density of the project. And so all the rest of it I didn't really care about what the project looked like, where they parked, all the other little things. They could do whatever they want as long as they kept those number of units so that there would be that many more affordable units and the price could be kept down. And so I think that that's the important thing that's about the high density, is that the way the low density zoning is and the way the world is going today, the yellow low density zoning, there's not enough land for it. We can't push outside the UGB for more. We can't push the edge. So we got to stay within the urban service area. And so if you can't build high density housing within our urban service area here, then the people who this area has a nexus that creates for their jobs and for their being able to live here, then they have to live somewhere else. And then that traffic goes out on Highway 37 or 121. So the whole issue of traffic and resources of where people are going to live is that you're going to have it here, you're going to have it there. If we have a responsibility for housing and we externalize that responsibility somewhere else, that just puts our issues on somebody else rather than us take care of it ourselves. And so that's why I was really supportive of this SAHA project. And I think also in terms of sustainability and world resources, there just simply aren't enough resources for everyone to have a low density, yellow zoned backyard where they can have all of the American dream, because with 7 billion people on Earth, there's just not enough resources for that. And so people are going to have less, and that's what the high density zoning is the start of a new regime of people having less because there's more people in the world, and then they stay in the places where it makes the most sense for them to stay. So I advocated for this project, and I probably wrote 15 articles about it in the Sun. So anybody who wants to go back and look at my track record of advocating for high density housing, I've got it all right there in the Sun. And a lot of the same issues that we're hearing tonight from the Donald neighbors are the same issues that were for this project. And I really appreciate the Planning Commission and Commissioner Barnett sticking up for wanting the fees to be low, and the Planning Director for wanting to take care of these guys and get this project going. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Fred. Anyone else? Seeing none, we'll bring it back to the commission for discussion and possible action.
I just want to thank Adam for coming. In the staff report, it says a permit is not deemed exercised until a building permit is obtained, but it's actually a building permit is obtained and construction commenced. So I just want to make sure everyone's clear on that. And then, per our earlier conversation, the burden is on the applicant to provide substantial evidence why this should have been extended. And in my view, the letter within our packet did not provide that evidence. And so I was a little concerned about that. But with Adam here and explaining the whole process, my concerns have been mitigated, as they say. So I would make a motion that we extend this use permit until May 3rd, 2020.
And if I could add, then it would also be that the commission determine that the permittee has proceeded in good faith and has exercised due diligence in complying with the conditions in the permit.
Yes, I would add that as well.
Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Okay. Any further discussion?
Can we get clarification on who got there first?
I think
Okay,
Commissioner Bohar got there first, I think. If there's no further discussion, a roll call, please.
Commissioner Kelso Barnett.
Aye.
Commissioner O'Neill.
Yes.
Commissioner Willander.
Yes.
Commissioner Bohar.
Aye.
Commissioner Barbos.
Yes.
Commissioner Larry Barnett.
Aye.
And Chair Felder.
Yes.
Motion is unanimously approved 7-0.
Yes. We will then move on to the public hearing, item 7.1. Is to conduct a public hearing on the preparation of commercial cannabis business ordinances within the city of Sonoma, including presentation and discussion of the types and locations of commercial cannabis businesses within the city. And then, having heard that, we expect to continue the public hearing to May 9th, when the council actually has a chance to produce what they want to be in the ordinance. Is that correct?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, David Storer, your planning director. I have with me to my right Mr. Tim Cromartie with HDL, and to his right is Mr. John Abachi with our city attorney's office. And we'll all be kind of chipping in tonight to present to you this item that's on your agenda. I'll just make some introductory comments with respect to the presentation tonight. We're here before you to let you know that we're in the process of preparing ordinances that will return to you on May the 9th, having been prepared and vetted at the City Council after you before July the 1st of this year. The goal is to present the ordinances with a recommendation from your commission June the 3rd and June the 10th. This next Monday, we'll be going to the City Council with some to receive further direction on some of the direction they gave us on March the 4th. Tonight, Tim will be presenting some of the basic constructs that surround commercial cannabis businesses, and especially how they apply to the city. I will be talking, and Tim will be talking about the direction that we received from the City Council on March the 4th, specifically as it relates to buffer maps. And I want to just talk about those for a minute, because what you see in your packet and what I've provided here are depictions of the direction of the City Council that we'll be receiving in their packet based, again, on the direction. So that direction has already been received from the City Council, given to staff. In addition, and there's actually 4 of them, and I'll go through them in just a moment. They also gave us direction to prepare a process for being able to deal with the applications that come before us, and they've also given us direction on the types and numbers of permits that they would like to see within the city of Sonoma. On that particular issue, I'll just talk about the things that the council did direct versus the things that they did direct with respect to what they want to see versus what they don't want to see. With respect to buffers, this first buffer area here would be the PROD, the Plaza Retail Overlay District, and I've just done something. The second area, and these would be buffers that Tim is going to talk about. These would be areas that are either over and above or below what the state allows, and I'll let Tim go into that. There are 4 areas that the City Council said we'd like to at least see some prohibition of cannabis businesses, commercial cannabis businesses. So this would be an area that the businesses, commercial cannabis businesses, will be excluded from. The second one is in and around the high school, and you'll see that this is not quite property specific. You can see that it is pretty much a radial pattern of about 600 feet or thereabouts around the high school. The third area is around the 3 schools that we have within the city, and you can see that this would be the Safeway area there. Does it show? You can see here that this is the shopping center where Whole Foods is, and this would be Sonoma Market here to the west. The last piece of geography that the City Council directed was to draw a 600-foot radius around the ball fields on First Street East. With respect to the types of permits that the City Council discussed, they talked about the prohibition on cultivation. They suggested that they would want to be interested in looking at an ordinance that did not include micro businesses, and Tim can talk a little bit about that, and also a prohibition on distribution, and he'll talk specifically about that. What that does mean is that the City Council would like us to prepare an ordinance that includes 1 manufacturing business permit, 2 retailers, 1 which would be a storefront, 1 would be a non-storefront, and we'll talk about that. And then the 4th provision would be, type of business type would be for a testing lab. And so what we'll do is I'll turn the time over now to Tim so he can kind of walk you through the basic construct of some of the state licenses and some of the things that were presented to the City Council on the 4th, and then we'll be ready to try to answer any questions that you have after the presentation. That concludes my comments, Mr. Chair.
Members of the Commission, good evening. Tim Cromartie with HDL Companies. I will be walking you through the ordinance as is proposed. This is the same presentation that was given to the City Council recently. And we're having technical difficulties. Why don't we just go ahead and do
We don't want to do spell check.
No.
Oh, wait, here we go. These guys right here.
Spelled correctly?
Okay. Brilliant, thank you. So first, the goal is to provide you with an overview of the ordinance to, as Mr. Storer said, discuss the permitted use buffer zones, the regulatory versus the conditional use permit process, review the direction of the council, give you an estimated timeline, and then we'll open it up for your questions. So the goal is effective local control of cannabis businesses. If you don't have that, then the ordinance is really pointless. The city can prohibit or regulate any cannabis businesses that are licensed by the state. That was guaranteed, and that basically goes back to the Medical Act of 2015, the Prop 64, and which legalized adult use of cannabis, and SB 94, which reconciled the two because one of them was far more conservative than Prop 64. All of those laws enshrined the principle that local governments would retain land use and police powers, which are granted to you not by statute but by the Constitution. So all of those, your local control, police powers, land use powers are expressly protected under current law. It allows you to prohibit or regulate any business. Delivery is still subject to legal review. The state has made an attempt that some view as perhaps illegal to reverse by regulatory fiat the express protection over your control of all business activities within your borders, up to and including cannabis deliveries. The city of San Francisco and others have taken the position that that was an illegal act by the state. It is now in litigation. The suit was filed earlier this week. So examples, you can regulate all permitted activities that are located within the borders of your town or city. Adult use delivery, retail sales in town, again, that's subject to further review. You can absolutely prohibit outdoor cultivation, which many cities have done, primarily because planning commissions and city councils don't want to deal with the complaints from residents. You may prohibit type S, large scale cultivation permits or micro businesses. And there are regulations on a variety of land uses, such as distances from sensitive areas. The sensitive uses are defined in state law as schools, daycare centers, and youth centers. Now, of those three, youth centers are deliberately, the state definition is frankly deliberately vague, because, and it's not helpful really, because the state wanted to leave it up to local governments to craft a meaningful definition for themselves. Many cities have struggled with that. Because it isn't clear. I believe the city of Martinez recently adopted a bright line test of any use or activity that is used exclusively by youth or only by youth. Other jurisdictions have been more or less creative with that, but that is something in state law. And the default buffer zone, according to state law, is 600 feet away from those sensitive uses. Now, you do have the authority to alter that buffer zone. You either lengthen it or lower it. It can be 1,000 feet, it can be 500 or 200 feet. You have the authority to do that, but it must be codified either in your regulatory ordinance or in your land use provisions. Way too far.
You want the buffers?
Yeah. There we go, thank you. So again, under Business and Professions Code Section 26054B, I believe it is, cities can designate a greater or lesser buffer zone. The distances must be measured from parcel to parcel. So there's no getting cute or bending the rules by saying, well, let's do it doorway to doorway. It's parcel line to parcel line as the crow flies, particularly with regard to schools. I think you can adopt a slightly different buffer zone or mechanism to measure the distance with the other sensitive uses. But with schools, the state is very explicit. They want the distance measured as specified in statute. And as I indicated earlier, the definition of state law is, definition of use center in state law is quite vague. Now, in developing the regulatory ordinance, a key function is that you do have the ability to enact time, place, and manner restrictions. For example, with cannabis deliveries, you can specify that the delivery can only be at a public place or a place of business, and or you can. Many jurisdictions have taken the position that deliveries can only be at a private residence. So there are hazards with that, obviously, because one of the key concerns many local governments have is, as we're allowing deliveries, are we facilitating getting this product into the hands of the youth? But if it's a lawful delivery to an adult who's 21 or over, it's not a problem. If it's even someone 18 to 21 who has either a medical cannabis card or a physician's recommendation, they too can receive it. But that documentation must be on record. So these are some of the basic headings for the ordinance. It doesn't, let's go back. This is not comprehensive. It's not a comprehensive table of contents, but generally the format, the major provisions are the authority and purpose, the intent. So the authority and purpose would certainly cite the laws that I mentioned earlier as the basis, the legal basis under which you are purporting to put this ordinance into place. The definitions are critical because they will very often inform, for example, the activities that you have decided to allow in your jurisdiction, among other things. Cannabis business permits are required. So you state very clearly that in order to operate such a business within your city, the city must, that business must have been issued a permit by the city. It will lay out the basics of the application evaluation process. Doesn't usually get into too much detail. There's a separate document for that, but it does lay out basic requirements. It will state the maximum number of permits and types that are authorized. That's generally going to be by the city council. That number can be subject to change or to periodic review, but it is codified in the ordinance. One of the most important ones is the requirement for an owner and employee background check, and that would cover owners, employees, managers, anyone with managerial authority over day-to-day operations, and should include, if they're allowed, volunteers. HDL does not encourage the use of volunteers in cannabis businesses because there's an accountability issue with whether or not that person's on the payroll or they actually acting under the authority of the actual business. And next, there's a section on fees and charges and the fact that fees legally are considered a debt owed to the city. And then there are the location and design zones and sensitive buffers, which tie into the buffer zone issue we've discussed earlier. The program must designate an official who's in overall charge. In most cases, it is the city manager, maybe the city manager's designee. The program will provide for a business permit, criminal background check. Then it will, assuming the applicants survive that process, they will be issued both a cannabis business permit and later there will be a land use authorization, which may take the form of a CUP. The city manager or his designee will implement the cannabis business permit and background check process. Very often that will be in concert with the chief of police. All cannabis businesses are required to comply with all state and local laws, rules, regulations, and standards. That is something that needs to be expressly stated in the ordinance, because what we've seen with this new area of law as we embark on local regulation, very often things that are not expressly spelled out in the ordinance can wind up being the subject of a future legal challenge to the city. I'll give you just one quick example. Shortly after Prop 64 was passed, there was a city in Southern California that had in place a ban on medical dispensaries. However, Prop 64 is about authorizing adult use or recreational use of cannabis. So a business came into the planning department, put in an application for an adult use business, and it was summarily rejected. And they said, well, why have you rejected me? You know, it's legal now, Prop 64. And the reply was, well, we have a ban, which we're authorized to enact under even Prop 64. And the proposed business their response was, yes, but you don't have a ban on adult use businesses. You have a ban on medical. The city responded, you're rejected. Bottom line is they wound up in litigation over it. And I think they wound up having to go back, revise their ordinance because it wasn't sufficiently specific. So there is definitely a need to spell out precisely what the rules are, what is and is not allowed. Another thing in the regard to buffer zones and land use in general is that the traditional rule around permissive zoning has been turned on its head by this change in the law with regard to cannabis. And permissive zoning, as you know, specifies that anything that's not expressly allowed as a land use or business activity in your zoning code is per se prohibited. Well, that's been thrown out with regard to cannabis. So there will be a need to expressly, in terms of all the state licensed activities, to expressly say yay or nay in the ordinance as to whether or not they're allowed. I will move on. Cannabis business permit issued by the city will be required. No one can operate a cannabis business in the city without obtaining all three: a local permit, a state license to operate such a business, and a valid state of California seller's permit that will be issued by either the Board of Equalization or the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration. So all three of those things are now necessary. If you don't have one of them, then legally you cannot operate your business. The details of the ordinance will speak to hours of operation, the location of the business, the rules, local rules regarding signing and advertising, physical security requirements, very often crafted in concert with the chief of police, smell, sight, and noise, so nuisance issues, reporting requirements, employee badge requirements, and unpermitted activities such as construction, etc. The ordinance will also cover rules on vendors and consultants, so that would be a visitor policy, and you will want to see and lay out rules for what must be done to maintain security and to track visitors and others who are not employees and who are not customers while they're on the premises of the business. Access control requirements. There's something called a limited access area, which is an area not open to the public and not open to consumers on the premises of the business. And anyone who is not an employee must be escorted through those limited access areas at all times. It also speaks to security issues having to do with how folks even employees can move through the facility. Will there be key cards? Will there be locked doors? Will there be other electronic controls on doorways? And who and under what circumstances will have access to the product itself. That's another very important one, because very often if there are problems with product shrinkage or product disappearing, in many cases it is usually employee related. So it's important to have these rules in place and expressly spelled out in the ordinance. Law enforcement access is another key one in the event of emergencies. Very often you'll see in ordinances a requirement for a hardened knock box on the outside of the exterior of the facility, which would allow first responders in the event of an emergency to get in, get keys, get access to anything throughout the facility. There are record reporting and retention requirements that has to do with the state track and trace program, which requires inventory tracking and compliance with the state track and trace program, which is metric. We don't believe that's online just yet, but there are requirements for software that is compatible with the state system. Next, the investigation and inspection protocols. If the owner or operator discovers that there's a discrepancy either in cash on the premises, because it is still primarily an all-cash business, or if there is a discrepancy with the amount of product, what are their reconciliation protocols, if any? How will they, and under what circumstances will they notify the city and law enforcement? Usually you want that done. There will be an express requirement for it to be done within about 24 hours. What is their good neighbor policy with regard to mitigating odor. That's usually the primary concern. But also, how are they going to maintain their premises? Are they going to have detailed procedures in place for removal of any waste? Because there are specific state requirements for how that must be done. Very often there are additional local requirements for how that must be done. And that is one of the areas where local rules may be even more stringent than what the state requires. You are allowed to have rules that are more stringent in general. You can't have less stringent rules in place so that there can't be any backing off of the minimum state requirements. Then it will run through issues such as suspension, fines, revocation of the permit, the conditions for the revocation, an appeal process if that's a desire to have in place. We usually recommend that a city have an appeal process of some kind to cut down on litigation where there's an allegation that they didn't have any administrative redress. They had to run to court first. Criminal background check, as I've mentioned earlier, is absolutely critical. Regulation of deliveries or prohibition, that is probably going to be decided by the litigation that's pending right now. The ordinance will also run through cannabis business permit procedures. In addition to the application, the evaluation process of the applicant, the ordinance will include procedures for, as I mentioned earlier, denial, non-renewal, suspension, or revocation of the permit, the appeal procedures, the transferability of licenses or limitations. Some jurisdictions have decided not to allow transfers of the license of the permit at all. There have been historically serious problems with that with regard to alcohol licensees who may be in trouble and under investigation for example, the violation of selling to minors. And if I'm the owner operator, I transfer it to my brother-in-law, and it's like the problem goes away, so it's on a clean slate. So to avoid that, we have the ability for local governments under the regulatory structure to unilaterally pull the license if a serious condition has been violated, and to decide we're not going to allow transfers at all. Background checks are required for everyone. That's definitely a best practice. There are a few reasons for that. You want an accountability factor, so you have a known universe of workers. This, again, is why we do not recommend allowing volunteers. Controlling access to cannabis facilities, and even within the facility, as I said earlier, who's got access to the product, who has access via key card or the appropriate key to get into the vault where the product is stored, to get into the cache, maybe a separate vault where the cache is stored. The key driver of product loss, as I said earlier, is employee theft. And no volunteers allowed violates labor law. Nonetheless, some cities have taken the position that they're not going to allow volunteers. But you do want to listen to your city attorney when they advise you on that one. I think we can go. You can suspend or revoke an employee permit post issuance if they're convicted of specified offenses. That's going to be covered by the criminal background check. They will have the right of appeal under the procedures laid out in the ordinance. There is a provision in the ordinance that expressly limits the city's liability, and applicants are required to sign that at the time that they submit their application. This will include a finding by the city council that the ordinance is exempt from CEQA. That provision is going to expire on July 1st, 2019, but it avoids the need for a time-consuming CEQA review that will delay the process, at least for the next few months. Fees are typically set by the city council by resolution. The goal of the fees is 100% cost recovery. So whatever it costs the city to administer the program in regard to most regulatory and enforcement activities against the licensed or the permitted businesses, that's intended to cover that cost. What that means as a benefit is that if you have a separate cannabis tax, that money can go into the general fund and be unrestricted for whatever purpose the city wants to direct those monies. No cannabis business permittee may continue operations until the fees are paid in a timely fashion, and then the fees and costs shall be deemed a debt to the city. Again, state mandated buffer zones, we've covered this. Now, the regulatory versus the conditional use process. The processes to consider options are either to take a regulatory approach only, a conditional use approach only, or regulatory and conditional use. We usually don't recommend conditional use only. The best have been either options 1 or option 3. And the main reason for that is a land use regulation can't cover all the regulatory contingencies and things that the city may decide it wants to enforce later on after you have the business in place. This graphic talks about the flow of the product, really. You're not allowing cultivation here, that's understood, but just so you get a sense of how this goes, the cultivators will arrange to have their product transported to a manufacturer. The manufacturer must get the product tested. Now, state law requires, and for manufacturers, just think of edibles as a good example. State law requires products to be tested in the form in which they will reach the consumer. So if it's an actual edible that's being manufactured, it's got to be tested in that form. So the raw ingredients for that edible are not necessarily going to be tested. It's a best practice probably for the business to test them, but they're not required by state law to do that. The manufacturer would then contract with a distributor who would arrange again for it to go to a testing lab. Assuming that it passes the state testing lab's evaluation, which is the mechanism by which the state is going to enforce the health and safety requirements, the potency limitations, etc., then and only then, under state law, is it allowed to be certified. It gets a certificate of, I believe it's a certificate of authorization, COA. Which certifies that it has been tested, that it's in compliance, and now it's authorized for transport and ultimately to sale in a retail outlet or dispensary.
Tim, can I just interject here at this point? Knowing what the presentation is, there's one point that I do want to communicate, the direction from the City Council. If you recall, I mentioned that the council said to have one manufacturing permit issued. They were specific with respect to the type of one of the four manufacturing permits. There's a type 7, a 6, an N, and a P. And if you can think of it in that descending order, 7s are volatile products that require the extraction through volatile mechanisms. 6 is non-volatile. The council was not interested in either of those and are okay with type N and P, N being just had a mind blank. Those are the edibles, excuse me. And then type P are the packaging and labeling.
Correct.
And so the council was interested in those. And I just want to kind of interject that before Tim goes on a little bit further down the line.
Thank you. Next, with respect to retail, storefront versus non-storefront. Well, I think you all know what a traditional storefront retail establishment is. In the connection with cannabis, a non-storefront retail outlet is a business it's basically a retail business, but it doesn't have any foot traffic of customers in and out. It's more like a warehouse that makes deliveries. So sales are either consummated online or they're consummated at the point that the product is actually delivered to the consumer. Law enforcement, in many cases, prefers non-storefront because they feel that there are fewer public safety problems with that model. It's purely up to the city. If you are, you're near Napa, obviously you're here in Napa Valley. So there's a tourist attraction aspect. Pardon?
Sonoma Valley.
Sonoma, I apologize. You should know to your audience. But because you are a tourist destination here in Sonoma Valley, you may want to think about storefront as well. It's an option, but I want to just give you the lowdown on why law enforcement likes the non-storefront approach. So the question is, should the city allow, which one of these should we allow, or both? If the answer is yes to either one, the questions will be, in what zone will these businesses be permitted? How many permits for that type are we going to issue? Will it be one or the other, or will it be both? And then again, what types of sensitive buffers and distances should be established? And again, you are not required or bound to use the state default buffer zone of 600 feet. You can craft a different zone based on advice from your planning department, from law enforcement, or any other factors. Now, in manufacturing, the critical issues again are Where should you be permitting that? Normally, as I believe has been said earlier, you will find manufacturing in either industrial or light industrial areas. There's a question about how many permits, and again, do you want to authorize type 6 non-volatile, type 7 volatile, type N, type P, or type S? And what types of buffer zones should be used? On this note, I will just let you know that the state of California recently reclassified ethanol, which has traditionally been considered a volatile substance. They have reclassified that as a non-volatile substance for the purposes of cannabis extraction. And that's based on a 2016 law that came in shortly before Prop 64, actually, and after the Medical Act had been enacted, that allows for the first time a legal form of cannabis extraction using either volatile or non-volatile solvents.
Yeah, Tim, can you just describe the Type S? Because I knew that there were 4, but isn't the Type S relatively new, a combination of sorts?
That is not a type that I'm familiar with. I actually, in preparation for tonight, I tried to look that up in the state regulations, and I did not find it. I found Type N, I found Type P, so I don't know. I'm happy to do further research on that and follow up with you. But that one stumped me, and I was kind of concerned by that.
Maybe somebody with, well, that's type as spaced.
So, testing. Should the city allow an ordinance to allow testing labs in Sonoma? If yes, the traditional questions, what are the zones, how many permits should be issued, what types of buffer distances? On testing in particular, you should know that a couple of things. It's important for there to be more testing labs because right now there's a serious dearth of sufficient testing labs, and it is making it problematic to systematically get product out to the retailers. But also, if you decide to site a testing lab in Sonoma, they do not have the same profit margin that some of these other license types have, such as retail, manufacturing, or distribution. And therefore, the revenue from that type of business is going to be appreciably lower with that type. Just something to be aware of. Now, how long will the process take? Here's an estimated timeline, assuming the start date of March 4th of this year, where the City Council met to provide policy direction. The timeline here indicates that through June, we'll be engaged in regulatory ordinance and land use development. That process is proceeding. June to July would be the application process and craft a schedule for cost recovery fees. And again, the goal of those fees is 100% of whatever the city must lay out to engage in the normal regulatory functions should be covered completely. In August through September, as we get into the fall, that is the window to open up and accept applications. September to October would be the application review period, where you get the criminal background checks done, you schedule the interviews. Some of the applicants will not pass the initial review of the written materials, so that everyone is not going to make it to the interview stage, and then obviously there's going to be further attrition with the interviews. In November, there would be a presentation of a staff report and recommendations to the City Council. In the final 2 months, there would be the period for awarding the issuance of the regulatory permit pending CUP approval of the operational agreement. So with that, there would be sort of a anticipated, and from this date, once the permit is awarded, it can take, depending on how quickly the business is able to get permits, depending on the site that they choose, whether it's a structure that's ready to go, whether it requires significant tenant improvement, or whether they want to build something from the ground up, that can vary the window as to when they actually open their doors and begin operations. Be happy to take any questions.
Let's start at that end.
Thank you for your presentation. That was informative. I do have several questions regarding delivery. And I understand that the non-storefront operation would essentially be a delivery operation. I noticed in some of the materials that typically, in order to sign up for a service like that, one has to present identification of one sort or another, a California license or something with a photograph with the operator of that facility, and which is obviously to prove that someone is an adult and so on and so forth. The other side of that is, however, if deliveries are going to be allowed, is there a way to require a signature from the person who actually is the member who has made the order, as opposed to a delivery person simply showing up at the door, ringing the bell, and giving the package to whoever opens the door?
Oh, absolutely. That would be a good practice. In fact, it might be something for the city to do. You'd want to run that by your city attorney, obviously, but it would be a mechanism for the city to shield itself from potential liability. For example, if there's an allegation that, this is being delivered to minors. You do want to, because one of the key things that will trigger potential federal enforcement action, they have a laundry list in the Cole memo, which has been repealed, but which remains, notwithstanding the fact that it's been repealed, it remains a good guideline because it outlined the traditional activities that will trigger federal enforcement when you're talking about cannabis. One of them is, are you facilitating the spread of the product to minors? Are you facilitating or furthering a criminal enterprise? And I think there were 6 others. But there were eight factors that were listed, and they've been repealed. It was only a guidance document anyway. It wasn't a change in the law, but it does remain a guide, an effective guide in terms of what are the things for states and local governments to think about and just be aware of if they're going to allow and regulate cannabis.
Okay, thank you. So sounds to me like some sort of signature required process would make sense. You mentioned it, and those of us who paid attention to this issue know that this is essentially a cash business, and until the federal banking laws change and these facilities are able to open bank accounts, that may have changed by now, but I hadn't heard of it. There's a lot of cash changing hands. One of the things I didn't see in your presentation was whether the city has the right to audit the financial activity of a facility like this as it pertains to any activity would generate fees or obligations, financial obligations to the city.
Absolutely. The table of contents that you saw was not comprehensive, but it does include a section on inspection and enforcement, and that provides detail on the city reserving the right to at any time come in and inspect books and records, the fact that it will be doing audits, and that the business should expect to have to be answerable for that. And you have the choice of doing those audits in-house or contracting that out. But that is definitely a best practice, and it's part of our ordinance template.
Okay. And you mentioned the issues pertaining to waste. And trying to imagine what that was, I could expect that certain of the products, particularly edible products, may well have a shelf life. And therefore, once they get past their shelf life, they have to be disposed of.
Correct.
So what requirements, if any, are included in the proper disposal and handling requirements for this material? I think, what I don't want to envision is this material just ending up in a dumpster and then people going to the dumpster at night and dumpster diving to see what they can find at the cannabis dispensary waste site.
Well, fortunately, the folks in Sacramento, in crafting the law, they thought of that scenario as well. So there are the following, and our ordinance basically reflects state law in terms of what are the requirements for storing and disposing of cannabis waste. If you have product that you've got to destroy because it's past its shelf life, as you indicated. First, they are required to keep the cannabis to be destroyed, or what is now waste material, in a secure container within the facility. It cannot be stored outside. That's the first thing. It must remain stored there until it is picked up by a certified waste hauler, which the business itself is required to contract with a certified waste hauler to carry it away. But in the interim, the business is also required to mix the cannabis with some other substance to the point that it's been rendered inert. So it's no longer the psychotropic substance, and what do they mix it with paper or mulch. That's not specified in the law, but they are required to mix it with something to render it inert and keep it on the premises in a secure location until it's picked up by a certified waste hauler and taken off the premises.
When you say a certified waste hauler, you're talking about a waste hauler certified specifically to handle cannabis waste?
Correct.
So that's going to be a new category of waste hauler. It's not going to be like Sonoma Garbage, who handles all of the garbage hauling in the city of Sonoma.
Most likely it will not be Sonoma Garbage, no.
Okay, so it's a new specialty.
Yes.
It's interesting how these...
There will be a lot of cottage industries that start to come
New
up.
specialties, yes. And then finally, you mentioned a cannabis tax. And I don't know if there's been any discussion at the city council level pertaining to a supplementary or special cannabis tax. David, do you have any information about that?
That particular topic it's not coming to my mind, but it is certainly, as Tim has said, part of a template that he has that we're currently reviewing.
Okay, so this is something that will be part of the ordinance. I asked the question because this is obviously a significant potential revenue source for the city. I had a conversation with the owner of a dispensary in Sebastopol who was generating essentially $250,000 a year in what he referred to as tax to the city. I have no idea what the rate is or anything like that, but I'm surprised to hear that there hasn't really been a discussion of a tax rate for this and estimates of what the potential revenue might be.
Yeah, that will be a component of the more detail. Again, the city council was more in tune at that time with allowing commercial cannabis and then trying to place the number and then the location and directed staff to prepare the components to regulate, and that will be a part of that model.
Well, insofar as this process is concerned, however, unless I'm mistaken, what in part is going to come out of tonight is going to be the recommendations of this commission as to elements to incorporate into the ordinance. What is exactly our role here tonight?
Yeah, tonight is to educate you into the world of commercial cannabis. And on Monday evening, we'll go back for additional policy direction on some of the things that we've talked about at the staff level in crafting model ordinances. And again, there's actually going to be two. Number one is going to be what Tim is talking about tonight with respect to Title V, which is the tax and regulatory provisions and licensing part of the municipal code. And then there's the Title 19, which is our development code, which will be coming back. And for the most part, that'll be the guts. But you will be providing on May the 9th, when we do get the ordinance, again after getting additional policy direction from the council on this Monday, we will then bring it to you. So you'll see the draft ordinance before the council will, just as we did with the wine tasting components, and take that forward to the council for adoption.
Okay.
Could I add just a quick point of clarification?
Yeah.
Normally, a tax ordinance is going to be a separate animal. It'll be a separate document altogether. And it will have to be, unlike this ordinance, which has been presented tonight, it would have to be submitted to the voters to be Prop 218 compliant. So the ordinance can unilaterally be adopted, the regulatory ordinance can unilaterally be adopted by the city council. The tax can be crafted by staff, approved by the city council, but it must be submitted to the voters to take effect.
And in communities where that has taken place, what's the tax rate that's usually been assessed?
Well, some have enacted taxes as high as 10%. I think Santa Barbara has a tax that can be up to, and they'll authorize usually a range, up to 20%. Those rates are not sustainable. Because the price is going to continue to fall. There's a glut of cultivation right now because we know that the state has already issued sufficient cultivation licenses to meet in excess of 200% of the demand in California. So there's an excess cultivation capacity issue that will affect the prices. There will be a number of cultivation businesses that fail. HDL's recommendation is that cannabis taxes, local cannabis taxes, be set at a range of 2 to 6%, maximum of 6%. There's multiple reasons for that. One of them is the existing state tax rate, which was set by Prop 64, and it allows the state to take the lion's share of what the traffic will bear in terms of what the rate is. The cumulative state tax rate is around 25%, because there is a 15% excise tax, which is attached to any sale. There is also a separate cultivation tax, which is equivalent to roughly another 10%. So right out of the gate, you've got a 25% tax, and we know from HDL, my company's primary book of business is sales tax audits for regular purchases. They got into cannabis about 4 or 5 years ago. They know from experience that with most products, the pain point at which consumers will decide to either not purchase or to purchase from the black market is a tax rate of about 30%. So we're already dangerously close to that 30% if the state has decided to tax at 25%. And that does not include the pre-existing taxes that are already wired into any sales purchase, such as Bradley Burns. So you've already got, depending on what county you're in, you've already got an additional 1 or 2% that's creeping you yet closer to 30%. So we recommend that cities be conservative in their tax rate. There have been multiple efforts to, by legislation, lower that tax rate. They have declined. They've all failed. The Department of Finance in Sacramento tends to oppose them because there will be a revenue hit. But last year was the first year of legal cannabis sales, and the state raked in about 50% of its anticipated revenue. Now, part of that had to do with the fact that many local jurisdictions don't yet have regulatory structures online. So in most cities today, you still don't have cannabis businesses that would be generating that revenue. That's just one factor. I personally think part of that is the high level of the state tax rate. And there's issues of the expense of market entry for the applicants.
Thank you very much.
I'm a little unclear as to the regulation of non-retail or non-storefront retail, i.e. delivery. I understand from your comments earlier that the subject of whether there can be retail delivery sales in the absence of an authorizing local ordinance is a subject of some litigation.
Well, just deliveries.
Just deliveries.
But not the brick and mortar business.
No, that's what I'm getting at, is deliveries without a brick and mortar.
Mm-hmm.
So that, I understand that part. If you don't allow it, it's kind of up in the air whether, and the courts will decide whether you can deliver or not. But my question is, if we're talking about licensing two, one storefront, one non-storefront, the non-storefront would be delivery.
Correct.
Is that the non-storefront delivery business that would potentially be licensed going to be located in the city of Sonoma and selling to just people in the city of Sonoma or anywhere they want to?
Anywhere they want to, because one of the effects of the recent regulation, the change in state regulations, pretty much says that deliveries are to be unrestricted. So there's a question about whether you can ban them at all now. But first of all, a retail business by definition has at its own discretion the ability to decide our deliveries are going to be part of our business model. And that applies certainly to the traditional retail storefront, but usually for non-retail storefront, since deliveries are their only way to get the product to the consumer, you know that that's going to be a part of their business model.
Okay, and then, so if we had a non-storefront retail doing deliveries, does that mean that other delivery businesses licensed in some other community cannot deliver in the city of Sonoma?
No, it doesn't. Per the recent state regulation, local governments do not have the ability to ban deliveries from outside.
Although I would have to add that the existing ordinance is typical of many cities in that delivery is only allowed from the outside of the city for medicinal purposes. That's under the authority of the statutory language. What Tim is referring to is the Bureau of Cannabis Control regulations, which recently came down, and those regulations are the subject of a challenge by the cities. So it's really unsettled at this point as to whether or not cities do have that authority.
Yes.
Following up on that, though, if the city of Sonoma authorized delivery within the city, that's the end of the discussion on that point, I assume.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, I mean, cities, of course, can authorize delivery outside the city. The question is whether cities can prohibit deliveries both inside and from outside the city.
Okay, thanks.
And again, Mr. Chair, if I can just add a comment, and this is for educating David, we would need to repeal the current law that talks about medicinal deliveries into our city and subsume that into this new title that Tim is talking about. And then if I can, on that same topic, have Tim explain now about the concept of distribution, because it was discussed at the council level to allow for the retailers, the non-retail and the retailer, the storefront, to have a distributor or transport only permit. So Tim, could you just talk about that for a moment?
Yes, there are two types of distributor license that the state issues. The traditional one, which allows for regional or even statewide distribution, is a distributor that has a business with a fairly large footprint because they've got trucks and whatnot. They have three key functions. One is obviously to move product between licensees, because legally product can only be moved between licensees. So from the cultivator to the manufacturer, or from the cultivator to the testing lab, and ultimately to the retail outlets or to the dispensary. They also collect the cultivation tax from the cultivators, the licensed cultivators, and they ensure, because they are the mechanism by which the product gets to the testing labs, they are the mechanism for collecting the product and ensuring that it gets tested. They also do quality control on packaging and labeling, so they have multiple functions that are very important. If you have a business, however, that wants to do its own transport of the product simply to save on cost, because it's obviously going to be more expensive for them to contract with a standalone distributor as opposed to doing it themselves in-house, they are allowed to take to apply for and obtain a separate type of distributor license, which is called distributor transport only. What that means is they are authorized to move their own product, no one else's, to the manufacturer, to the testing lab, ultimately to the retailer, but they would not perform any of the other functions I described. So no tax collection, no, they probably would verify correct packaging and labeling, but no tax collection and no transporting of other businesses' products to testing labs.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I've got a couple of questions. This might be geared to testing laboratories. I'd like to know more about the labeling in terms of showing the amount of hallucinatory material, TCH, in the items, particularly the edibles. And the national media has focused a lot on that in the last couple of years. It seems like it's important to know about a dosage and effect and so forth of these products. Is that a function of the testing laboratories to test for these issues and label the products accordingly?
Well, they are certainly required to test for those things. The labeling is handled by the distributor.
I'm sorry?
And the labeling is handled by the distributor.
So the distributor is going to make decisions and label as to the strength, perhaps, of the TCH
No.
and the impact?
No, well, let's back up. The testing lab will test the product. When they complete the test, assuming that it passes and is in compliance, they issue a certificate of authorization. The certificate of authorization contains all the information you just described. How much THC is in it, what's the THC and CBD content, or the ratios, because particularly for medicinal purposes, that can be very important. Whether it passes they're required to test for certain contaminants, metals, mold, fungus, pesticide residue. So all of that would be on the certificate of analysis. It's a COA. And then the distributor doesn't make any decisions. The distributor simply labels the product according to the contents of the certificate of analysis. So it's the testing lab that made the decision and said, okay, this is where this product falls within the range and whether or not it's in compliance. So it's the data provided by the testing lab that goes onto the label. The distributor handles the physical labeling of the product.
So no one is making a judgment and providing that to the public about the potential impact of edible as far as the strength of the material or so forth. The consumer's got to make up his mind on that?
Well, the Department of Public Health is in part responsible for crafting maximum potency standards, et cetera. I think that process is still ongoing, but they will be working with the Bureau of Cannabis Control to set those standards and to impart them to the testing labs in terms of what the standards must be.
Now, we have a lot of marijuana being distributed around Sonoma County. Are you telling me that those standards are not in place by the material that's being sold now?
They are being developed and they're being fine-tuned as we speak. Here's the problem. The federal ban, the fact that this is a Schedule I drug, has frankly blocked a lot of the research for comprehensive knowledge about the effect of cannabis and THC on the human body. It affects everyone differently. Unlike alcohol, it is not metabolized by the body quickly. It can remain in your system for weeks. So it's a very different substance. And the fact that this product is a Schedule I drug has had a chilling effect on acquiring funds for the kind of research that would give us a comprehensive medical knowledge about what this product can do to us.
I quite agree. And that's been clearly presented in the national media, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, other leading magazines. And it seems like this city should know that, know more than there is available right now before we're going to start distributing this material, to me.
Well, you raise a valid point. In a perfect world, we would have had the equivalent of a impaired. You have a standard. You have a blood alcohol standard for alcohol, beyond which you are considered to be too impaired to drive. There's no equivalent standard of that type for cannabis.
I understand.
We are years away from that.
Well, I'd like to have my comments on the record somehow. I feel those are very important. Please. David, are questions available on any part of the written presentation here?
Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Well, I'm not sure that we went through the entire written presentation that was in our package. Can I ask a question about other things that perhaps weren't mentioned?
We have an expert here, so please feel
Fine,
free
okay.
to ask any questions.
It mentioned that likely the city manager would be in charge of regulating and implementing the cannabis program. Is that the current thinking?
Yeah, our model includes not only, again, as Tim mentioned, a regulatory process, but also having the land use process as well. So we're having the two pieces intertwined in the model that we're talking about at the moment.
Well, let's assume we have the dope czar in town. Is that planned to be the city manager at this point? Some person who is responsible for the program of cannabis regulation and distribution and sale. Is that accurate?
Well, ultimately, the responsibility with the city council, and if I could just kind of talk about in generalities, the regulatory process will be such that we'll have a process in which to look at all of the applications that come in, as Tim was outlining there on the timeline. We'll receive applications. We'll take those qualified applicants to the city council for them to determine which ones it wants to proceed into another phase of the land use component, which would be the use permit. And then when the first process is added then to the second piece, then there would be actually the issuance we're talking about at this point as far as issuing a commercial cannabis business permit, that particular component would be issued by the city manager, but it would be a ministerial process. So we're going to be talking about introducing ministerial processes and discretionary processes that the planning commission will be involved with. All actions of the city manager would, of course, be appealable to the city council. So that's why you get from the city council the first part to issuing the types of candidates or finalists to a part where it then transitions to the planning commission, the city manager, and then appeal procedures to go to the city council.
And that is a standard regulatory approach in our ordinance template.
No, I wasn't so concerned about the process that you described as much as someone's going to have to be the person in the city who's responsible for overseeing the cannabis program. That's what I was trying to drive towards. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, and just like a business license, the ultimate responsibility will be the city council as directed by the city manager. The city manager doesn't actually issue each business license. So for example, in the case of medicinal deliveries in the city, I'd make a recommendation to the finance department after an application has been presented, and we go through the process of making sure that there's a local land use permit, a local business permit, and in this case, somebody in Santa Rosa would have to get a conditional use permit, get their business license in Santa Rosa, and then come and obtain a business license from us, all at the same time being regulated by the state for whichever type of license they need from the state. And so I would be considered the cannabis czar, I guess, in that case. But ultimately, the responsibility rests with the city manager and then the council again, because they're the ones that put into place those processes.
Okay, I just was noting the piece in here. It says highlights program to be run by the city manager or designee. I was just thinking that was going to be a fairly big ongoing responsibility, and it's pretty well known amongst those who do business with the city that the city manager has a wide variety of large responsibilities that takes an enormous amount of her time and energy. And given the fact that this is a revenue-producing item and it's going to pay for itself, it seems like we should have someone designated to do that, other than another burden for the city manager just to.
Well, that is why the language says city manager or his or her designee, because we're very much aware that in certain cities, the city manager's duties are already quite sufficient to keep them busy 100% of the time.
Okay, thank you.
This is a question, Tim. In terms of the concept of this being a moneymaker, and I believe I heard that the first goal is to break even to recover all costs associated with administering this. I'm curious, I know this has not been around for a long time. Has there been documentation that these programs indeed do generate money to the city of significance?
Well, as you point out, I think we're only 14 or 15 months into legalization, and many cities don't have enough, even those that have enacted ordinances with taxes in place, there's not enough of a track record yet to be able to answer that question conclusively.
Okay.
Again, just to kind of go back to that comment, and then Commissioner Bohar's, the city council's issuing, or not obligated to issue all four, but is willing to look at issuing four. And the staff that will be necessary for that may exceed our limitations at the moment, or our capacity at the moment. And many jurisdictions will hire companies like HDL to run their operations, and that's certainly something that the city of Sonoma can look at. Again, the main component, let's say, for example, all four are issued by the end of this year. In a year from then, they'll be go through a renewal process. And so depending on what the city manager decides, whether that's done in-house or in the outhouse, for example, that would be something that we would look at.
Okay. Has it been your experience, Tim, have any communities that you have been consulting with started out more conservatively and allowed for a dispensary of one type, and then it was more of an evaluation on seeing how that works, in lieu of what I believe the city council now has directed us to accept one storefront, one non-storefront, one manufacturer, and I'm sorry, what was the fourth one?
That would be the testing lab.
Testing.
Yes, cities are all over the map with how conservatively or aggressively they approach allowing these businesses to come in. Many take a conservative sort of let's dangle our toe in the pool approach and authorize only one or two businesses because they're concerned about, A, how is this going to go? B, do we have sufficient regulatory capacity? Is it going to be worth, is the headache of regulation going to be worth the revenue that it generates? So those are questions that cities are struggling with all up and down the state right now. And some of them do have a conservative approach. And then it also depends on, what is conservative. In many cases, it will depend on the size of the city. A city the size of Los Angeles, 10 or 20 dispensaries would be super conservative for them. They have, I think, City of Sacramento, prior to Prop 64 taking effect, had 58 retail locations. They're now down to 30 because they've implemented a process whereby a lot of these businesses had to file applications, pay their fees, be compliant with taxes and land use provisions, et cetera, and that helped to winnow down the number of businesses. But certainly you're justified in thinking that the best thing to do may be to take a conservative approach, and you can always broaden it later. It's a lot harder to take a really aggressive approach and then try to dial it back if you have businesses that now feel vested in the community, et cetera.
Thank you.
If I can just, did you have something?
I just one more question. My last question has more to do with, just to refresh my mind, we will be granting a use permit to these applicants?
Yes.
And do we have the opportunity to, as we have in the past for some applications, grant a temporary use permit with the expectation that, A, how is it being administered, how is it being managed, is it going as it was sold to be, and then have that period of time in which they would then come back, and it's a very minor illustration, but the Sebastiani music venue comes back every year to be reevaluated, and we ask questions like, were there any violations, were there any complaints, and it just seems like it would be prudent to have something along that line.
Yeah, I'll have Tim address that, and maybe perhaps John.
Okay.
We do have a history here in Sonoma of issuing a timeline on a conditional use permit as opposed to issuing a temporary use permit. Two different mechanisms. With respect to the conditional use permit, I'll let them speak to Tim and John talk to the timing of it and its implications to the commercial cannabis business permit. But you will have the opportunity through that land use process to deal with things like parking and hours of operation that are not otherwise specified in our zoning, in our zoning code, or even in Title V. Tim?
In terms of the universe of businesses that the city hosts, one of the provisions in the ordinance is maximum number of permits and types authorized. There is a clause in that provision which expressly authorizes the city council to, on an annual basis, revisit the number of permits and the types, and to adjust it either up or down, depending on the conditions and the council's judgment as to how the cannabis program is proceeding.
And I lied, I have one more question then and follow back up. Again, I understand the program is not that old, but when there are violations, is the state and county and or city municipality pretty responsive to the violations, or is this again one where sometimes it's not until a complaint is issued that something is looked into?
In our draft that we're talking about that very question, and I believe, please correct me if I'm wrong, that any violation, or for example, if an employee somehow gets, is it a felony or runs afoul of the process, that would be grounds for revocation or non-renewal, depending on the timing of it.
And in terms of how active the state is on enforcement, it depends on the issue. They're not going to roll out for every individual violation. Certain violations they will take immediate action on. For example, testing labs that fail to give consistently accurate results, testing labs that pass non-compliant product as compliant. They are very swift about taking action up to and including shutting that testing lab down or revoking its state license. However, I need to emphasize that when I was at the League, I was a public safety lobbyist at the League of Cities for 5 years before coming to HDL. In that capacity, I fought for and helped craft the regulatory process that we have today with respect to protecting local control. We were clear about one thing. We did not want to duplicate the alcohol license model, which is a state-only enforcement model. The reason that we have dual licensing for cannabis businesses in California today is we wanted to get away from the ABC model, and we wanted to base it on what they had in Colorado, which allowed locals to opt out, which required both a state license and a local permit in order for a business to operate legally anywhere in that state. So, for that reason, in many cases, depending on the nature of the violation, the state will sit back and expect the locals to take action. And frankly, that is to the benefit of the local governments, because you are empowered to step in and take unilateral enforcement action up to and including revoking the local permit. So you have the ability to deal effectively with a significant problem if it comes to that. But there are certain violations, as I said earlier, that the state will say, step aside, we'll handle this one, because it rises to the level that they feel they need to get involved.
And Mr. Chair, if I can just have Tim talk a little bit about testing labs, because I found that particular information interesting when it was presented by Mr. McPherson at the council with respect to how many there are and the ability to have them within your community.
Yeah, the testing labs are extremely important in the overall regulatory process because, again, they are the mechanism by which the state enforces the health and safety standards, potency and purity standards, et cetera, and whether or not the product has, whether it's in compliance with, the permissible level of toxins of whatever type and pesticides. Right now, I believe there are only, I believe it's less than 40 testing labs that are operational statewide. And in a state this size, with the number of cultivation operations and the cultivation capacity that we have coming online now, that is woefully inadequate. So there is a need for more testing labs. They are critically important. They do not have, again, the same profit margin as some of the other license types, but they are very critical to maintaining health and safety standards and to having any cannabis program succeed.
To that extent, has there been any consideration then given that before more licensees are issued, that if there isn't a sufficient number of testing labs that to do the safety checks as you've just expressed, why would we continue to issue licenses if one of the key components that you've just stated is the testing lab for the safety and health and safety of the public? Why isn't there some sort of relationship then?
Well, I believe the state is trying very hard to get more testing labs online as quickly as possible, but it does seem that there is not the kind of strategic coordination of capacity in the respective license types that you would like ideally.
Tim, thank you. This has been really educational. And I can't help but compare this to our last discussion about wine tasting rooms on the plaza. And I'm amazed at the level of scrutiny, criminal background checks. We sure don't ask that of our tasting room employees. Pretty cool. So I like that. I like the paying attention to where the schools are, the parks. We certainly don't do that with any of our wine tasting rooms. So that's pretty interesting. I think a big part of it to me is that it's a cash business. And as long as the federal government is going to require it to be a cash business, it puts a more inherent risk in place than does the product. I think it's really the cash that's the scary part, not the cannabis. I do wonder what happens as the environment changes, meaning what if a new school comes in and we've allowed a cannabis operation to be there? What will happen to the ability for that cannabis business to continue, or do we just not let schools go within the area? And I'm wondering how that gets handled.
Many jurisdictions take the approach that if obviously they want to abide by whatever buffer zones they themselves have established in citing the initial businesses. The wrinkle is that sometimes there are several rounds of putting out requests for applications, and you may have the first round and everyone's compliant, and then 10 or 15 years from now, a school will come in and it's inside the 600-foot buffer zone in relation to a particular business. Under those circumstances, a number of cities have added a provision to their ordinance saying that under those conditions, that particular cannabis business would be a legal non-conforming use. So that's how they deal with it. And that's an option for you. It's certainly simpler than requiring the business to move, which can possibly result in litigation. But that is an artful approach that a number of cities have taken to avoid that problem. You raise a good question with regard to the cash, and I just want to briefly speak to that. It is not the case that no cannabis business can bank with FDIC-insured institutions. There's actually, I was at a conference recently, and there was a component on banking, and there's actually no prohibition in law against banks taking cannabis money. The problem is that the banks are required to abide by know your customer protocols and to mitigate their risk to the maximum degree possible. The mere fact that they are obligated to do that as a fiduciary, if they accept money on deposit, makes them very nervous. And so many of them have just said, given the history of this particular industry, the cannabis industry, and the fact that very often criminal activity has been associated with it, or money laundering, or et cetera, it's just outside their comfort zone. So they have decided we're not going to take it. The businesses that do have banking relationships, many of them are under the following scenario. Someone has operated, for example, a farm or an auto repair shop, and they've decided we're gonna move into cannabis. They have an existing banking relationship. They may have banked with Wells Fargo or B of A for the past 25 years. Because they are a known entity to the bank or a known customer, under those conditions, the bank is more comfortable taking that type of an owner's money on deposit, notwithstanding the fact that it's a cannabis business, because they have a relationship with that individual. In many cases, the cannabis businesses that have bank accounts, that's why. The other issue is that some of the credit unions are more willing to take cannabis money. They too are fiduciaries. They too have to mitigate risk. They have a different they don't have the FDIC breathing down their necks, but they do have the National Credit Union Association, which has its own financial institution regulator that the credit unions have to deal with. So it's a similar thing, but for some reason the credit unions feel a little more empowered to take the money. The other issue is that many of these businesses, to mitigate the serious public safety issue that an all-cash enterprise entails, many of these businesses will contract with armored car companies to come pick up their cash on a regular basis, hopefully not at regularly scheduled intervals at the same time every day, but they will contract with an armored car company to come up, take it, and get it off the premises to either a secure location where they store it, or in some cases, they will deposit it direct to a bank if there's a banking relationship, or they can even deposit it direct to the Federal Reserve in, I believe, San Francisco, if they're within range. So there are a number of stopgap, admittedly temporary options that do mitigate the risk of the all-cash factor of this industry. And there's a bill moving through the legislature right now, AB 717, that would require, because the state agencies that are collecting tax money have the same issue. They've got, what are we supposed to do with all this cash? So there's a bill to require the state agencies and authorize local governments to contract with armored car companies specifically to dispose of the cash that they collect in tax revenue. It would also obviously be available to the businesses, but interim solutions like that are going to be necessary because there's a serious amount of cash moving around, and it has to be dealt with somehow in a manner that is consistent with public safety.
Thank you. That's really my biggest fear is the cash, not the cannabis.
Thank you. Thank you again very much for that presentation. I think the entire cannabis process with the consultant has been very high level, and I think that's really has served this process well. I don't think we had that when it came to tasting rooms, so hopefully in the future we will have this kind of analysis. When it comes to the process, though, I guess my first question would be for our planning director. Typically, historically, when we would talk about policy, something like this would, at least the process would start with the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission tends to recommend policy to the City Council. and then they consider it and they either accept it or do something else, but then it ends at the city council. And it seems like, at least in this process, everything has started with the city council, and it's basically, I mean, I guess I don't really understand maybe the process, I understand the process, I just don't think it is very efficient, or it makes a lot of sense. It starts with city council, they come back, they tell us, I mean, they did this whole thing, I watched that meeting, and they got very detailed on number of types of businesses and facilities and where and all that, and I feel like their minds are made up, and so they're also going to send an ordinance back to us, and I feel like we're going to have four meetings here when it could have been a little more efficient.
Well, I can't really address, your concern to the degree that it'll give you an answer that you want to hear. That is the structure of our government system, where you are advisory to the city council. In this case, you will be the body that sees the ordinances before the city council does, and so you will see them for the first time, two of them. One primarily deals with land use, and I think that's where the city council's specifically looking at for your input, along with the Title V changes. But with respect to issues like parking, I think I raised it at the city council meeting, and one of the council members, I believe it was Councilmember Hunley, spoke about the difference in parking standards, for example, with these types of businesses. They don't generate the same, they generate a lot of traffic based on those dispensaries that we know about, but their method of people coming in and out of the property is a lot different, spread over a broader spectrum of time during the day. And so those are the kind of components that I think will be helpful for the Planning Commission to be able to direct to the council. And we can do that in the two ordinances, specifically Title 19, when we address those kind of issues in the code, in the zoning code. But as far as the timing of who gets it first, I know
Well, it's
that
just, you're going to be writing an ordinance based on what the city council tells you to do, which is totally appropriate, but historically, like, the ordinance would start here and then go to end at the city council.
The city council has not told us what to write other than some broad parameters with respect to the number and the locational questions. And they've asked us to go craft that document. We're going to go back we're going to go to the council, and we received broad general policy direction on the 4th of March. And we're here before you tonight to bring you up to speed with what they heard and saw with some additive information. And on Monday, we're going to go to them to ask some general questions about what we've now discovered or come up with respect to what we're thinking of crafting in an ordinance. We'll get that general direction again from the city council. We will then actually get down to finite documents, down to the language with the resolutions. Tim hasn't spoken yet about the resolutions that need to accompany the ordinances that deal with the fees and the kind of process we have to give ourselves permission. We have to grant ourselves permission, I think it is, Tim, to have DOJ and FBI certifications on the background information. There's accompanying resolutions that go along with that, processes for the chief of police, fees and things like that for the background checks. You'll get all of that, I believe, at the May 9th meeting. When you've noodled through that and come forward with a recommendation, the council will see those ordinances for the very first time, ostensibly June the 3rd.
So next week it's going back to city council. Then you're going to write an ordinance and resolutions, presumably based on city council input. What happens if we don't pass the ordinance that the city council directed?
I'd like to interject one thing, which is to just share with you that the way this process has played out in other cities is that the Planning Commission does have the ability to make recommendations for amendments. And they may or may not be restricted to land use issues. In one city, it was the city council that, the Planning Commission that was also presented with this conundrum of, okay, how are we going to define youth center? Because in one case in that city, it was causing a lot of problems because there was a proposed business that was located well inside the 600-foot limitation, literally in the same building as a some sort of a athletic center for kids, but it wasn't exclusively used for that. So anyway, the Planning Commission took the bull by the horns, and they just decided, we want this to be the rule. And in that situation, the city council was frankly so relieved that they didn't have to deal with it. They gratefully seized on the recommendation that the planning commission had made, and that went into the ordinance. So you do have the ability to craft some policy.
Yeah, and you'll be forwarding a recommendation on those ordinances, so you could change, certain components of it. If you think the hours of operation are bad, or we need to look at parking, whether you want to recommend that the buffers need to be total radiuses of 600 rather than some of the things that we put in those diagrams tonight. You can make those recommendations, and we could forward them.
Well, I suspect we can even make recommendations on the numbers and whatever. Just as a recent example from wine tasting rooms, when that went back to the city council, what they ended up doing was adopting what we recommended as opposed to what they started out with.
I just think it would be more efficient. We can talk about this later, and I don't know how many more policy questions we're going to have before us in the next few years, but to me, this is not an efficient process. Before we move on, I noticed the library there's no buffer zone around the library. Typically, I view a library to be a youth. There's no buffer zone. I generally have always viewed the last time I was at the library, I was a youth. So, that was a joke.
That was a long time.
Actually, it could be true, but why isn't that? Why is there no buffer zone around that?
One thing you might have noticed in your packet tonight is we actually had 3 maps in there that we did not provide in the presentation this evening, and that was because of the direction that we got specifically on buffers from the council on the 4th. But primarily, we provided those in your packet tonight so you could see what we did present to the council, because 6 months prior, those were the maps that were being discussed by the city council, which included the initiative information and the maps that were proposed there, in addition to a very broad, additive or inclusive set of boundaries where there had been some parks identified, and particularly in I think one of the maps, some of the schools had moved. And so we kind of introduced that information, but we wanted to make it clearer to the council that that had happened. And so we did go into a discussion of specific buffers, and that's why I said you had the ballparks, which were considered the youth serving places. What was I'm forgetting the
Youth
word.
center.
Yeah, youth centers. Thank you. And then also that's why you see the 600-foot radius component around the schools. And then we also went around some natural boundaries as well to exclude some of the shopping centers, which seem to be the more likely place for them to appear.
Yeah, I guess that's my final question, because I was going to talk about the maps.
There is a buffer here for the library.
No, that's the old map.
Yeah, the one that was in your packet is the one that we presented to council on the 4th.
Because
the one that you saw tonight is not.
So I'm looking at the maps that you provided with, the yellow, the highlighted. And, there seems to be 600 feet around the high school and Adele and Prestwood and then around the ball fields, but it seems like there is not around St. Francis or Sasserini.
Can I just add that one of the reasons you may not see that is the first cut of the buffer zones will usually reflect what's mandated by state law. And that state law defines sensitive uses. There's only 3 things on that list: schools, daycare centers, and youth centers. However, local governments do have the ability to add to that list. And the 2 things most common are libraries and churches.
Mm-hmm.
So, and to the degree you add things that will, obviously it's going to cut down on the available land use and land area in which you can locate a business, but you do have the ability to add other things to the sensitive use list.
Well, I was just talking about St. Francis and Sasserini.
Isn't
They're
that
both
figure
schools.
3, Kelso?
Sorry?
Map 3?
Yes, figure 3.
Yeah, and so what
The
we
line
also,
is right on Sasserini.
what the point is to not include those, but Tim hasn't mentioned yet, and he can perhaps address it, but you can also go less restrictive than the 600.
Correct.
And so what we did there was just simply go around some of the roads that made more sense based on the land uses that are there. And you'll see that on the...
I'm actually confused with that concept. If the concept is a 600-foot radius around the schools, why would...
Well, again, it is left to the discretion of local governments to adjust those buffer zones as they see fit. The only real requirement is you can have a greater buffer zone or a lesser buffer zone, but as I said earlier, it must be codified because you don't want any subsequent allegations that your buffer zones are arbitrary or...
Well, and the simple
that's my
solution, Commissioner Barnett, is when we get the ordinance in our hands on the 9th, we can specify whatever buffer zones we choose to include and put it to the council to go for it.
Okay.
I mean, yes, it's not necessarily the most efficient thing, but this is the process we have in front of us, and this is the one we're going to make work.
I have a question that's kind of about process and deals with what the comments that were just made. I mean, just based on what some of us have raised up here, it seems like, I mean, a prudent discussion would be, do we want to roll out all of these things at the same time? Maybe we just want to start with a storefront retail and see how that goes, and then maybe add the delivery and the testing later on. But to what extent are we expected to make any recommendations on this stuff? And do we have to just accept this stuff lock, stock, and barrel, say, yeah, sounds good to us, because otherwise what are we doing here?
Well, again, as we mentioned at the outset, please continue the item to May the 9th, because you will get the first crack at making your recommendations to the city council on the ordinances. And you'll be able to then discuss, well, we don't think there should be one non-storefront and one retail. We think there should be 6 or 0. You can add in all of that kind of stuff. You need to do a better job on the security background checks. You can ask us to get wider buffers. Maybe it's 800 feet.
Why aren't we doing that tonight if you're dealing with them on Monday as to what the ordinance?
Let me suggest a path forward here. We have had a presentation, we've had questions of staff about that presentation. I'd like to open it up to the public, give them a chance to speak. We will then bring it back to the Planning Commission, and I would hope that we would then step in at that point and make specific recommendations on what staff should be crafting in that ordinance that we see on the 9th. And in that line, I have one further question on what was presented. We were talking about cultivation, and I believe it was stated that cultivation was not going to be permitted in the city, but it specified both commercial and personal. Right now, we have an ordinance that permits personal cultivation.
Well,
is that not correct?
Local governments have the ability to absolutely ban commercial cultivation. Prop 64 authorized personal cultivation. You can still ban outdoor personal cultivation, but you have no ability to prohibit indoor personal cultivation.
My point is, we do allow outdoor personal cultivation at this point. Is that something the council's trying to repeal?
No, that'll continue.
Okay. All right, I think at this point I'm going to open it up to the public, and I'd appreciate that everybody would try to hold it to 3 minutes or less, and let's go.
My name is Gil Latimer, and I live at 1055 Grant Court. Good evening, commissioners. I'm here tonight representing the over 200 members of the Sonoma Valley Cannabis Group, and we'd like to thank the Planning Commission for moving forward on this issue. For nearly 2 years now, we've been at the forefront of the effort to encourage the city of Sonoma to permit a dispensary and delivery service that would provide safe, legal access to the residents of Sonoma and its nearby communities. We're gratified that the City Council has now elected to write a comprehensive cannabis ordinance that includes cannabis businesses. In light of this, we ask the Planning Commission to support the City Council's proposed regulations to allow certain commercial cannabis businesses within the city, and that it take care not to overly restrict zoning or permitting that could hinder qualified applicants from establishing business operations. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good evening, Planning Commission. Again, Fred Allebach at 19550 8th Street East. As far as the buffer zones, I noticed that kids from the high school walk home right through where CVS is, and they can go into CVS and go past like a nuclear arsenal of $8 a gallon cheap vodka and gin. And they could just walk right in there. So it seems like the whole thing of a buffer zone is really ridiculous when you have every weekend some kind of bacchanal festival on the plaza, and everybody whose picture in Sonoma has always got a wine glass in their hand. This is a complete culture of intoxication. And so that to make a buffer around school zones is almost ludicrous, it seems to me. And so if you're going to have a cannabis business, it seems like you should reduce those at least so you would be reasonable. And then I would be remiss if I didn't quote Freewheeling Franklin in Fat Freddy's Cat comics, who said that, remember, pot will get you through times of no money better than money will get you through times of no pot.
Thank you, Fred. Anyone else? See, oops, almost lost it, Tom.
Almost lost. I don't. This is not my issue. I don't really. But there's so much after watching the wine tasting discussion, and the fact that Fred just spoke to that. I feel like, if I understand it correctly, it looks like the current proposal is to not do any dispensary in the downtown area. And that just strikes me as strange, because if there are concerns about keeping an eye on these new businesses, we don't know exactly how they're going to play out, especially public safety issues. It seems like that's the place where the most eyeballs are right now. We already have enforcement in that area. So if we're going to squeeze the balloon and push this new industry off into an outskirts of the city limits, I'm worried about that. And I don't know the solutions. I haven't been following this matter closely. I appreciate all the information tonight. But that issue bothers me a little bit. I think we should think that through. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Hi, guys. My name's Tess. I live in Santa Rosa. I am a mom. I have a 10-year-old daughter. I grew up here in Sonoma County, and I come out of the wine industry. I currently work now in the cannabis industry. We have a dispensary in Sebastopol called Soulful. We are always very interested in how the different local municipalities are handling, changing the cannabis ordinance. And for what it's worth, having worked in both wine and now in cannabis, and again, being a mom, I think it's really important to note that the people you see coming out of a winery in the middle of the day are very different than the people that I've personally seen coming out of a dispensary. I think, of course, it's important to be thoughtful and to pay attention and keep kids safe. But, very much to some of the comments from your community here, the kids are going to see it at the grocery store. They're going to see, again, people spilling out of wineries in the middle of the day, getting into their cars, driving away. That simply, at least at Soulful, does not happen. The majority of the people that come in are over 50. A lot of them are shopping for non-psychoactive CBD products, to help them with their arthritis, to help them sleep. We've done a lot of work with the senior community, even here in Sonoma. We did recently a talk at Vintage House. It was a packed room. A lot of people are driving all the way to Sebastopol, so we just wanted to applaud you guys for taking the time to even consider this. And we hope that it's something that can enhance your community the way that it has Sebastopol. And, Sebastopol has done a lot, and I recommend you guys reaching out to their city council if you have any questions, because they've been really thoughtful and, progressive with it. So thank you guys for your time.
Thank you. Tess, can we get your last name, please?
Oh, all my personal details. Yeah, my last name's Kofoid.
Thank you.
Of course.
Anyone else?
Hi, my name is Claire Firestone. I'm a Petaluma resident, and I have the non-storefront retail in Petaluma. And I just want to say that we are focused on educating consumers so they're not just handed an edible and saying, try it out and see what happens. We do have, everything is marked with the strength, so they have some guidance on how much they're taking, and we want to make sure that people do understand what it is that they're getting. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? I'm going to close, Last call.
Hi, John Kelly, trustee for the Sasserini area for the Sonoma Valley Unified School District. It's very nice to see you all tonight. I remember many years ago, a decade ago, being in front of a couple of the members of this commission, and at that time we were talking about how we might reform this commission and how it might change. I think at that time I was advocating that we switch to a method where some of the commissioners be directly chosen by the council people, and that idea did not fly that night. But I did not expect that one day that reform would occur, and the very council people that I was talking to that night would then end up on the planning commission 10 years in the future. And so it's been just very interesting to see this tonight. And so Steve and Larry, both of you, it's wonderful to see you here on the commission, and it's exciting kind of to see the way you guys are engaging with the issues. And I wanted to say that first of all. Second, I wanted to thank Commissioner Barnett and Kelso Barnett this time for bringing up the issue near Sasserini Elementary, because I think I saw the buffers that were set there for Sasserini, and it actually would allow a dispensary adjacent to Sasserini as well as directly across the street from Sasserini. And, I think all of us at the school district very much trust the planning commission to make these kinds of decisions. Land use is your ambit. And, to the extent sort of like the school district is the custodian of the valley's human capital, the planning commission in many respects is the custodians of the sort of natural capital, the land of the city of Sonoma. And so you often have a sort of foresight type vision, just like the school board does, except in a different sort of domain. And you've built an expertise there and you demonstrate it regularly. And so we trust that you will, balance these competing interests in terms of buffer space. But it was very encouraging to hear that issue was brought up tonight. And I don't think that anybody has a particular take from the school district's perspective at this point on any particular provisions of this ordinance, just that as the ordinance is formed, the considerations that were voiced, we would very much like to see those continue to be voiced and taken account of. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Going once, twice, back to the commission. So what I would like to do before we get a motion to continue this to the 9th is if you have specific recommendations for things you'd like to see in whatever the staff is crafting as an ordinance, I think this is the time to do it.
Well, I gather that the council, and I wasn't party to their discussion, didn't like the idea of a downtown dispensary in the plaza area. I'm not sure why that was, frankly, given the nature of the plaza. And so I personally would like to hear more discussion about why that was. Can't hear it from the commission here, but I hope that when the council brings this whole matter up, that is re-examined. I believe I'm correct. We're only talking about even allowing this use in commercial zone, right?
And I believe there will also be some components of the mixed-use district as well.
Well, that's what I was unclear about, because I noticed on the earlier maps that we're not looking at tonight, the mixed-use area going up Broadway didn't seem to be considered at all. I think that given the high school and the buffer zone that would have impact there, there'd be a pretty radical reduction of opportunities along Broadway. But nonetheless, there may well be some spaces that could work on that Broadway corridor. So I'd like to see a consideration of the opportunities in that area. A speaker mentioned CBD products. This is really a question for Tim. At this point, CBD products aren't covered by the statutes regulating THC comprised products. Am I right?
That's not correct. The existing regulatory structure, state law, covers both THC and CBD products.
Okay, well, I'm a little confused then. I was in Pharmaca the other day, where they have removed their magazine racks and some other product and other shelving put up, and I said, well, what's going on? Looks like the store's changing a little bit. He says, yes, they told us to get rid of the magazines. I said, well, these air purifiers aren't going to be a big mover for you. What are you going to put in this space? He said, oh, it's going to be our CBD area. So my daughter, who sells natural food products and superfood products and organic food products to both the grocery and the supplement segments of retailers, also sells some CBD products, CBD chocolates, and various other CBD products that seem to fall under no restrictive categories at all, except when a particular retailer gets nervous and decided they didn't want to carry them anymore. So there seems to be something evolving here as it pertains to pure CBD products.
Well, I think there's a lot of ignorance out there on the part of retailers and the public in general on the state of the law and what is and is not legal. The current regulatory structure covers both THC and CBD products. Most cannabis of whatever type, whether it's an edible or what have you, is usually a mix of the two. To have a pure 100% THC product is frankly dangerous. Usually it's THC with some ratio of CBD. Even the folks who want it for arthritis, it will be a heavily CBD-based product. It may have a certain small percentage of THC in it because the two work in concert for various effects on the human body. We know that much about the science of cannabis. We don't know much more than that, frankly, but we do know that they work in concert. So it's rare to find a 100% THC or CBD product. Both are covered by the existing regulatory structure.
That's fascinating. I guess my last comment would be this. In roughly the 1918 or so, Harry J. Anslinger initiated the national program to condemn the killer weed, the demon whatever they used to refer to it as, marijuana as a dangerous product, and it ended up in the Class 1 schedule, and alongside drugs like heroin and so forth. And he was in charge of the drug program of the United States for 30 years or more, and it was left us with a legacy that Tim has talked about tonight, which is certainly in the 60s when pot became very popular among young people. It's been essentially a component of American culture ever since. And yet we know very little about the actual medical and psychological effects of marijuana because of the legacy of Harry J. Anslinger and the attitude of the federal government, which cut off the opportunity for research and study of something that was widely in use, simply as for the purposes of criminalization, and largely the criminalization of minority communities, because it was an easy and ready way of providing a vehicle for law enforcement to clamp down on both Latino and black members of the American population. So I'm personally glad to see that we've gotten to the point of legalization. I'm not happy about the mercantile commercial mechanism and industry that's going to form around this. I think that's unfortunate. I guess a part of me would have just simply liked to have seen decriminalization and leave it at that, but that doesn't seem to be what's happened. We're in for something I can't possibly anticipate. I think the whole issue of edibles versus smokables is like an entirely different world, and the regulations need to be developed separately for both, because they are, as in terms of effect, from what I gather, completely different. And so I think we're just at the beginning of this. Unfortunately, the current generation that's growing up are going to be the guinea pigs of a whole new industry and a whole new set of products about which nobody really knows anything at all. And so that's the era we're in, and I'm glad the city's taking a careful scrutiny of this whole thing and coming up with a plan to manage it and review it. I support that. So I'll just leave it at that for the moment.
We don't have to go in order unless you have specific comments.
I'll preface this by saying I went to UC Berkeley in the 60s. So this is a topic that has been familiar to me for 60 years. I think I applaud the City Council for finally getting on with this and legalizing sale of recreational marijuana in the city of Sonoma, just because it makes no sense to not allow it. The majority of the people in this city voted for Prop 64. It's what people want. That said, I share concerns about, this kind of this monster that's been created from a regulatory standpoint, and I think what we're seeing is it's such a monster that the black market pot is not even close to going away. Because this is too cumbersome, too expensive, and too much of a headache for people to deal with. And they're not going to do it unless it's really enticing to them. So I don't know what we can do about that, but I just want to share those are my thoughts about the process, and we need to make it accomplish public safety objectives in a common sense way that doesn't unnecessarily complicate and regulate this. I share the view that they ought to look at, or the council should look at, having retail sales on the plaza. That is the prime commercial real estate in the city. And it's home to, we all know how many tasting rooms. I can't really justify why there wouldn't be a dispensary, given what I've seen in terms of how, I've seen Mercy Wellness, that's the only one I've seen in California, but it's highly regulated. Getting in and out of that place, it's not, you don't need to worry about people wandering in there who, shouldn't be buying pot and coming out with some. This is not going to happen. It's just not happening. There's, as was explained to us, people come into an area, it's controlled, there's no product in that room, then they get let into a safe room or a safety enclosed area. They don't get out of that area without, going back out the way they came in and basically checking out and carrying the product out. And that one, I don't know if this is uniform, in a sealed bag that you can't even open. So, I don't think that the concerns about the, and this guy kind of goes to the buffer zone, but the concerns about where retail establishments could be are really a public safety issue. I look at it as more of a PR issue, and I think maybe the council thought that this was not the face they wanted to put on Sonoma, is a dispensary on the plaza, but I think that they should reconsider and take a look at that.
Mr. Chair, if I can, to comment, I recall when you were talking there.
Okay.
Chair Barbos, the council did discuss this, now that I'm thinking about it, on the 4th of March. And please feel free to go watch the video of the meeting. And I think the thought was that we just need to ease into a program, and that they would perhaps look at that as a secondary phase of the plaza specifically. But they wanted to start out with not so much baby steps, but let's kind of roll it out, for lack of a better word. That wasn't a good word, was it? But as far as roll out a program, and then maybe perhaps expand the plaza at some point in the future, because they did talk about where on the plaza it could go, given the limited space that we have available.
Places open up, but that's more of a commercial real estate concern than a city government concern. But continuing, my thoughts are about buffer zones. They're kind of a function of the reefer madness mentality.
That's the word.
Something horrible is going to happen to these people if they're within 600 feet of a store where this is being sold. That's crazy. I mean, some buffer zones seem appropriate, but I personally think that 600 feet is an arbitrary and excessive number. That said, looking at the map on Sasserini, I think it's too close. I mean, there's a lot of people coming and going. Just a practical standpoint, if you ever try driving by Sasserini, it's nuts over there, with all the people dropping their kids off and picking them up. And that is already one of the worst traffic hotspots in the city. So, I mean, I think the council should try to get a retail dispensary in either the Whole Foods shopping center or the other shopping center over there. I can't ever remember the name of it, Maxwell Village, that one. Because they have parking, they have multiple storefronts of varying sizes, and it would kind of just be innocuous, another commercial thing. So, I mean, I think that's where they should start this.
Yeah, we if I can add to that, because it's bringing up a lot of memory now of the meeting, and there is no buffer up there at Maxwell, and so that would be a place where it could be. What your commission could do is when you look at the maps tonight, you could say, David, instead of the 600 around the high school, we want it to be 1,000 or 1,500, whatever, and increasing it around Sasserini, for example. But the one that has the shopping centers omitted, it was because of that particular discussion that you're just having right now.
Well, figure 3 is the one that has Sasserini and St. Francis, and it looks like it notched out the Whole Foods shopping center, so it's not included. There's nothing to say you couldn't push the buffer zone out. We're talking about the area in front of Sasserini, not the area where that shopping center is, at least in terms of what I'm talking about.
Right, and your commission can certainly give that direction to us, and we'll provide that in the draft.
And that's mostly, I mean, there is some, and just right above, I kind of forget, is that the Safeway? Yeah. And then that little shopping center across the street from it. I mean, I certainly think they could consider extending the buffer zone a little bit in that direction, whether they want to exclude Safeway's shopping center. But to me, it makes sense to have it in a shopping center, the retail aspect, if there's a testing thing. And then I guess my last point, and I don't know how this would shake out. It seems like doing 4 new things all at once that all have separate regulations, that all are going to have to be regulated by the city and the compliance officer, is asking too much. Let's start with retail. If they want to have delivery too, okay, I don't know how much additional or how different that regulation will look, but do we really need the other part? Is that something we could phase in downstream? I just think, if there's baby steps to be taken, that's where it should be, in the rollout of the number of different types of cannabis. Start with the retail. That's the biggest demand.
Yeah, and again, that's the discussion that the council had with respect to how it gets. But what the council did want to do is it wanted to give at least the parameters for us to construct an ordinance. That's why they said, let's not do cultivation, micro businesses, and distributing. And they kind of provided it with those confines with respect to what it did want to see. And Tim can speak to the ordinances that he's crafted, but It doesn't require the council to issue all of those 4 all at one time. It can issue 0 if it chooses, depending on the quality of the applicants as they go through that process of screening.
Okay. Those are my comments.
Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. Item number 1, I'd like to strongly encourage that we spell out the specifics as clear as possible and we minimize the gray areas as much as we can possibly do. I would also like to have us be very thoughtful on what would be acceptable signage and what would not be acceptable signage. I do not want a Carol Doda blinking red light at the dispensary. I do not support transfers. I'm just going on record now as far as the idea of transfer of license or permit, whatever, from somebody else. And I think that the comment that the citizen made about putting the dispensary in an area where there are a lot of eyeballs makes a lot of sense. I also do believe that it would be appropriate, if nothing else, to have some buffer zones from the critical areas, the high school, the schools, ball fields, etc. But I think, as my fellow commissioner kind of said, that it seems if we're going to have one, why not make it a little bit easier and really dedicate some areas such as the shopping centers that have significant retail now, that have parking, that have a lot of eyeballs circulating around, rather than, as again the gentleman said, pushing it out to the edges where there may not be as much public circulation. I appreciate the fact that several people from out of town who have been involved directly in these new, relatively new businesses have spoken. I hope that we continue to have dialogues both with those communities that have current dispensaries and distributions and testings, that we continue to seek feedback, both from a consumer standpoint as well as from a government standpoint as far as how it's working for the government. I would really like to see us create some sort of new map that identifies some sort of reasonable buffer zone from these critical areas, and then really see if the net, given the fact that we're a relatively small community, if the net allows for any place to have a dispensary. I do not support the idea of a dispensary on the plaza more from a historic standpoint. I just like the history of the plaza and let that be the principal read. And I can say that I'm not advocating, that's not the right word. Anyway, I was not involved in all the permitting of the tasting rooms in the plaza. I certainly don't support that. I think it lessens the significance of the plaza. I wish we could have done something different, but I think that there'll be plenty of other opportunities in the town, hopefully in a commercial shopping center, to put a dispensary so that it need not be on the plaza. I think we need to cultivate the historical aspect of the plaza and the fact that it's an open space, significant public open space. And I was just going to say, too, that with the maps, I didn't see any type of buffer zone from the Field of Dreams. I know we picked up Arnold Field, which is the football, baseball, but if we're using the test of gathering of students or kids, the Field of Dreams is a fairly active recreational area. And again, I am open to having kind of a moldable distance in terms of the buffer zones, given the specifics of our town, and not just taking a blanket pass at it, but keeping in mind concerns about kids, et cetera, et cetera. And that's it.
Anybody else?
My issue remains cash. I just want to make sure that whatever regulations and guidelines we put together, buffer zones, et cetera, I'm more concerned about the high risk of thieves going in and getting the cash. That's been a big issue in Colorado with their legalization. I don't worry so much about kids walking past a cannabis dispensary, and just like I don't mind them walking past wine tasting rooms, but that large amount of cash that's in the business and being transported to and from the business, that is a security concern. And that's why I do want us to really address how we will handle that and what kind of safeguards we'll put in place to ensure that the businesses are secure and that the people surrounding those businesses are secure, because that's going to be one of our biggest issues. The banks won't take the cash, the credit unions won't take the cash. That cash is coming and going. Tax payments have to be made in cash. I think water bills have to be paid in cash. There's a lot of cash, and that to me is what I think we need to address and deal with. I think that the federal government will catch up with this, I hope. But right now, I think that's my biggest concern, is as we're looking at where do we put these and how do we regulate them, is just making sure that the business is protected and the surrounding neighborhoods are protected from that issue.
Thank you. During the city council discussion, I'm fairly certain that they are not allowing these in mixed use zones, with the goal, to some of the earlier points made tonight, to try to encourage these in established shopping centers, which are all zoned commercial. So I'm fairly certain that that's council direction on zoning, and I would actually support that as well. When it comes to radii, I guess, I just want to be relatively consistent. If 600 is too much, I'm open to having it less, but I want that to be as consistent as possible around all schools and youth-oriented facilities. So the Sasserini example stuck out to me because, and on that one, I think you should probably include the Safeway property, perhaps maybe not the smaller shopping center across the street, but I would like the radii around youth-oriented facilities to be consistent. And so if that's smaller, that's fine, but that's sort of the direction I want to go on that. And if we are going to be doing youth-oriented facilities, I think we need to include all of them. So I do think the library is considered a youth-oriented facility. And if you want to do a smaller radius, that's fine, but then apply it to all of them. And then I think we forget, in that Maxwell Shopping Center, there's a Boys and Girls Club teen center there.
And miniature golf, too.
Correct. And which may preclude that. I do think there's a problem when it comes to radius, the concept of the radius or the radii, because as Tim earlier said, it's from parcel line to parcel line. And so when we're talking about a shopping center, that's the entire parcel. So even though the shopping centers are very large, and you could get a small little place, by CVS, which is far enough away from St. Francis or whatever, the parcel line starts at Napa Street, if I'm correct. And so I just wish there could be some flexibility on that. And if there's not per state law, then perhaps there could be, at least locally. I don't know exactly how that would work, but I feel like a dispensary in a certain part of a shopping center would make sense. I just don't know how we regulate that. When it comes to the plaza, I think I currently would not support a dispensary on the plaza. But I do think once a dispensary opens in this town, I think people will, to the earlier points, realize that they are not the sort of threat that some people think they are. And perhaps over time that could happen. But I do support a sort of go slow, conservative approach to this. And I think in watching the council, I feel like they really considered all that and also sort of endorsed a relatively go slow. It does seem like there's a lot going on. And I would probably support Commissioner Barbos's thought in just terms of just focus on retail for now. The reality is those other uses may not even appear, whether it's lower profit margins or it just it doesn't make sense, to open up a lab in Sonoma when it could be somewhere else in terms of transportation, infrastructure, et cetera. But I feel like we're going slow, and perhaps over time this will change. I do think we're in sort of a transition phase here. I feel like 25 years down the road, you'll just have legal cannabis products similar to tobacco, and you'll see them at CVS and 7-Eleven, and this whole dispensary thing I don't even think will be around years down the road. And so logically, I think all the points, especially Commissioners Barnett and Barbos made, make a lot of sense to me, but I think it is still new culturally for some people, and so just going a little slow in the beginning I think is probably good. And quite frankly, I think we're sort of ahead of some other cities as well. So for, small conservative Sonoma, this is fairly progressive. And then my last point is a point I made earlier. So I would just, again, like to convey to the city manager or to whoever is creating this process, it makes absolutely no sense to me that, we have all these points. Some of us are in alignment with the council. Some of us are not in alignment with the council. But then it's going to go back to the council, and then they're going to direct the ordinance that's written, and then that's going to come back to us, and then we're going to have those sort of differences again. And I don't know where the reconciliation is on that. Like, for example, I don't know if the council or the commission here doesn't like that ordinance that comes back, what happens at that point. Perhaps that won't be an issue, but generally I feel like, at least historically, going years back, and we have two former members of the council, one former member of the Planning Commission and Council, it seemed like legislative policy sort of started with the Planning Commission, and it was all formulated here, and then ordinances were written, and it was recommended to the council because they have so much on their plate anyway. They weren't getting into the weeds on all this, and it seems like something is not making any sense to me. And so, if the city manager is watching, my point has been made.
I'd just like to interject with one other thing on consistency. We should be careful when we're looking at buffer zones, to consider the churches, because a number of the churches have daycare centers. So if we're going to start to talk about youth-oriented facilities, we've got to consider any church that has that type of a facility as part of its operation.
I just want to reemphasize the idea of understanding the coordination between the testing labs and the distributor and seller in terms of the labeling from a consumer standpoint, labeling contents, having something about dosage, impact. I think from a public health standpoint, we need to be aware of that, because I think it's somewhat acknowledged that there are holes in that information, and I think we should understand that more effectively. Thank you.
And to the chair's point, I agree with that in terms of all the different youth centers, but I think we should be consistent.
Yeah, I mean,
and if that just ultimately reduces, if that just prohibits them anywhere, then maybe they have to come down. I don't know, but it should be consistent. It seems like we're sort of picking and choosing which youth centers we want.
Make the stay out zone something that's consistent, but also then make the places that we select be consistent. If it's youth-oriented facilities, then we've got to select them all. And go ahead.
Oh, just one last comment. While I decried the process of what I'll call commodification of marijuana, and the downside of it is the commodification, the marketing and the branding and all the rest of the rigmarole that goes along with commodifying products. On the plus side of commodification, it's just going to be an ordinary thing. It's just going to be another product that's out there, and it's not going to be considered, oh, isn't that unusual, or boy, that's weird, or oh, that's fascinating me. Teenagers are always going to be fascinated with something that, in theory, beyond their ability to purchase. It was true when I was a kid about cigarettes. I mean, buying cigarettes when you were 14 or 15, I mean, this was a big deal. And then it became beer, and, this has always been the way it is in our culture. I think that the issue of the buffer zones, in all frankness, is more of a political and an optics issue than it is an issue of actual impacts. I don't think that kids who are 9 years old, who are walking by a dispensary, are going to be any more inclined to try to figure out how to get something out of the dispensary than would be going by a liquor store. They're not allowed to buy it. And you walk in and you get carded, and the guy says, "Get out of here. You can't buy beer. You're too young." And they won't even get in the door of a dispensary because when I took my sister who's from New York to a dispensary in San Francisco because she had to see what one looked like, we went to a place called Harmony in San Francisco. There was a guy 3 times Tim's size standing at the door with a uniform on, scrutinizing everybody who went in and out. He was a big guy. He was like a football-sized guy. So, I think that we can go overboard on this buffer thing. The fact it is the matter that it's not going to result in fewer kids being exposed to a increasingly commodified intoxicant that is eventually, as Kelso has said, going to be a commonplace product that you can get in CVS. Whether that's 5 years from now or 10 years from now or 20 years from now, I don't know. But if the trend continues to go in the direction it's going, that's the way it's going to be. And so I'm not sure if the buffer zone approach actually makes sense. I mean, the kids at Sasserini's a elementary school, I think goes up to 5th grade. 5th graders aren't going to be walking into dispensaries. Why do they have to have a buffer zone around it? I mean, I think it's, as I say, politically it may be popular, and from the optics it may be popular, but from a practical standpoint, it makes no sense at all. It's silliness.
I agree, but I think I think, as I believe David, the planning director, Tim said, it's easier to reduce than expand. So no, I agree.
I'm looking then for a motion to continue this item to May 9th.
So moved.
Is there
Second.
a roll call, please?
Commissioner Kelso Barnett.
Aye.
Commissioner O'Neill.
Yes.
Commissioner Melander.
Yes.
Commissioner Bohar.
Aye.
Commissioner Barbos.
Yes.
Commissioner Larry Barnett.
Yes.
And Chair Felder.
Yes.
Motion is unanimously approved 7-0.
And I'm going to call a 3-minute recess. This meeting back to order, and I have a question from Commissioner Barnett.
I'm wondering whether we might want to consider moving the discussion about the CEQA to a subsequent meeting.
I have already considered that, and I was about to suggest that.
Ah, you're a man of my own liking.
So, yeah, in that light, even though CEQA is important, and we wanted, it was my idea because we had that discussion about all the things that are coming up in CEQA, but it's my opinion that it's a lengthier discussion than we can do right now. I think we've evoked some interest from the public on this one to the point that maybe we will have a joint meeting with the city council a little earlier rather than later. But definitely we need to talk about it, and there's a lot of things in the streamlining and everything else that we need to be aware of. So, but I would like to move that to a date uncertain for that discussion, if that's okay. Is that the will of this commission?
Well, how about next in May? I mean, when you said date uncertain, I mean, a lot of this stuff I thought was sort of time sensitive.
Well, you realize what we have in May
I do
is
not.
the ordinance for cannabis. You think that's going to be a short discussion?
Well, I've already given my thoughts about the efficiency of this process.
But
But
I'm willing to put it back on the May agenda, and we can
Well, why
always
don't we-
postpone. Well, we can do it to continue it to
Could we
May
add an
9th,
additional meeting?
and we can always push it on, or if we think it's warrants an additional meeting on
Well,
that topic alone.
maybe agenda item 8.3 will fix some of this. But I agree that this is a very important topic that really deserves everyone's attention. And so I'm open to moving it. I just don't want it to be indefinite because whether it's the UGB or the general plan, I mean, there was a lot of stuff I was looking forward to discussing here.
No, and I agree. That's why I asked to have it put on the agenda, but the time has gotten away from us yet again. So let's move it. I don't think we need a motion for that, but let's move it to a discussion item for May 9th. And if
maybe a motion to continue.
Okay.
Let's do a motion to continue.
Mr.
that
Chair,
to May.
before you do that, just
All
a
right.
point of discussion and clarification for staff. I certainly wasn't prepared to go into a presentation tonight, or a discussion, in fact, on the whole concept of CEQA. It was more of a, here's some material for you to consider as you go through our learning process. We've been discussing a lot of different CEQA things with respect to categorical exemptions, but we haven't been talking about EIRs, mitigating neg decks, things of that nature. If that's the intent, then we would need some time to prepare for that in light of the other things, the responsibilities that we have within the department. And so I'm not saying don't put it on the agenda, but I just want to let you know that those things are what I was thinking about.
Well, can I just jump in and say, I'm up to page 235 in this book that we were given, and it is a great read. And if you're not cracked it open yet, you're missing a real page turner. And I'm not being facetious here. If you're interested in planning, this book is really fabulous. And the section on CEQA covers virtually everything that was in the presentation that the staff prepared, and in more detail, of course, than the presentation did, because there's an actual discussion of the case law and the discussion of how things have evolved. It's not that long a chapter. If you don't want to read the whole book, you can just read the section on CEQA. It's got a separate chapter of its own, and it's clear, concise, and really informative. So.
Well, I think what I'd like to do is at least bring it back on May 9th so that, if nothing else, we can initiate the things that concern us most. And maybe you have to go off and prepare a different presentation for that, but at least it gets them on the table.
Yeah, maybe we bargain here that we put it on the agenda when you all tell me that you read that chapter. And then there'll be a test. There you go, by May 9th. No, I think that's great, because if we can kind of get your thoughts on what to prepare for you, whether it's the case law, or whether you're really interested in just initial studies, or maybe it's the initial studies and what a supplemental EIR is all about, or an addendum to an EIR.
Well,
We haven't talked about those kind of things.
And it seems to.
Just ask questions?
Yeah.
Now? Or?
Well, I don't know if we want to, it's going to be another hour if we start that. Yeah, either we do it or not. But I think that.
Can we do a meeting prior to May 9th? Because I think this is an issue that's going to roll into so many of the projects that are coming forward. I just worry about us not delving into it.
Well, one of the things that concerns me the most is that with all of the streamlining and the search for avoiding environmental review, I think we have to be knowledgeable on what is permissible and what isn't, and what the case law is, and where do we go.
Well, and I don't see it all being done in one night either. And so CEQA has been around for 40, 45 years, and there's a lot of components to it. And we'll be kicking in gear with our council. For example, we could probably spend an hour on traffic, whether it's LOS or VMT, new legislation. We could go down a lot of rabbit holes. I want to make sure we identify. Maybe you could give us, what topics it is that you're interested in. We could start at a 101, which is what the book does. It actually is quite thorough in what the salient points are of CEQA. But when you actually get into an initial study, we could go through checklists. We can go through a whole different thing. So it would be helpful, if you want to not have that discussion tonight, let's not have it. Let's agree to have that at the next meeting, and then we can kind of focus where it is that your interests are.
Right, and I would suggest that if we get to that discussion in the next meeting and we feel that there's enough that we need to know in a rapid fashion, then we try to schedule a special meeting after that. Okay, so that, can I have a motion to continue this item to May 9th?
I move we continue the item on CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, to the meeting of May 9th.
Okay, thank you. Is there a second?
A second.
Roll call, please.
Commissioner Kelso.
Aye.
Commissioner O'Neill?
Yes.
Commissioner Willander?
Yes.
Commissioner Bohar?
Aye.
Commissioner Barbos?
Yes.
Commissioner Larry Barnett?
Aye.
And Chair Felder.
Aye.
Motion is unanimously approved, 7-0.
Let's move on to item 8.2, and this is really a brief presentation, I believe, by the planning director to discuss why we are doing action minutes and what is included in them. So,
Yeah, Mr. Chair, nothing really more than just I try to come up with the questions, put them into a coherent sentence, and present them to our city clerk, Rebecca. So these are her responses that we've worked together with council to respond to you. If we haven't got the questions right, give me the questions again. We'll go back and get it right the next time. But we do have council here tonight that can kind of help me out on this with respect to the responses.
so we can open this up for a little discussion at this point then.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to ask what the impact or effect of being the official legal record is. I ask that because when would it be used and why, and in what way would action minutes provide guidance to a body that's attempting to resolve or adjudicate a dispute in a matter, which is, of course, why it has is the official legal record.
Well, it is an interesting question, and in years past, one would say that the minutes were the only record of the meeting. They may have been audio recorded, but you would barely understand the audio recording. Nowadays, of course, with how technology is, the record of the meeting is kept on tape, and a transcript can be made of a discussion during a meeting from the tape, whether it be a videotape or an audio tape. So minutes are the official record. They're an important record, but as long as videotapes are kept of the meeting, there is still a record of what is said and what is done at the meeting, and a transcript could be made from that. So, and often they are. If a case goes into litigation, if a decision goes into litigation, there will be a transcript made from the meeting audio tape, for instance.
Okay, which brings me to a couple of other questions. In reviewing the tapes of a number of meetings, both essentially of the city council, I've noted that there are either skips or gaps or jumps in the videotaped record, which actually eliminates portions of comments at the meetings. At a recent city council meeting I reviewed, it was actually the city attorney who got cut off in the middle of a statement he was making, and it just jumped to somebody else's comments during the meeting. So my question is, what happens when the tape that's the videotape that includes both sound and picture has gaps in it? And secondly, there's been mention of a separate audio tape of the meetings. Is that audio tape recorded in the same or by the same system in a contiguous fashion to the videotape, or is it something separate? Who maintains that record, and how long do these materials last? In other words, who's responsible for maintaining them, and who has proper custody of these materials, if in fact they do eventually have a bearing on a legal matter in the courts?
I did ask Rebecca about the audio recordings. I think, and I hope I do justice in her comment, there's an independent audio recording, then there's also an audio recording with the guy that does the video as well. So you got two separate audio recordings, and then you've got the audio and the video through the cable TV.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a bit confused on how many video recordings there are. I know that there is a video recording that's uploaded to the city website, but is that the same recording for what is uploaded to YouTube, or is that a separate recording?
I believe they're separate, but I can get clarification on that. I think there are two separate, because when the one that we have fails, we go to another source to.
So there are, that's what I thought. I think there are two video recordings as well. And if you can't find it on the city website, you can go to YouTube and you can pull up an amazing number of YouTube videos.
Don't you find it a little scary that YouTube is the official record of anything that happens here?
Well, that's the question. Like, what happens? I mean, we don't have like the file, you know, like the April 11th, 2019.mov, like in some sort of hard drive somewhere. Like, what if Julian Assange steals YouTube, or maybe he can.
Here's the answer right here.
Here we go.
All right. It's a little complicated, but there are. Bob Taylor. We have a recording system in the back room here, and it's recorded, and it doesn't skip, and it doesn't jump, and it doesn't do anything like that. And it is recorded on a file, and it's recorded on a second file, and it's also recorded off-site for us. There's also another device that streams to YouTube that belongs to the city that we have nothing to do with, and that's the issue with that device right now. So whenever that device fails, I send them the raw file, which gets re-uploaded to YouTube. So we do 3 backups simultaneously, and they do a backup, and the audio is recorded in this room on a device in the corner on its own independent system, and the moment the audio is stopped, it is uploaded to a site out of the building. So those are all of the.
So are you the custodian of the files then?
Yeah, I share them. We put them on a Google Drive,
Mhm.
and I have my own hard drive here and another set of hard drives at our shop. So there's we have 11 years of video.
And if I can get an opinion from the city attorney's office, how should the chain of custody of materials like that be handled? And where does the responsibility sit?
Well, I believe Bob's company does that work under a contract with the city. So therefore, there's a contractual responsibility to the city.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Taylor. I'll open this up to the public for comment if you would like to comment. Seeing none, I think we'll close this item. The final item on the agenda tonight was a result from a question from one of our new commissioners at a prior meeting. As you can tell, we have a way of extending a meeting for at least 3 to 4 hours without having very many items on it. There's two things we can do. We can start, well, three things. We can start earlier, we can schedule extra meetings, or we can quit talking so long. And those are the choices, but we're going to get through the material. So I'm open to anything that this commission wants to do, but the obvious one is that I think we all have to take control of what's the salient point we want to make and keep our, as Commissioner Wellender would say, keep our comments to 3 minutes as much as we can as well. Or starting earlier, I don't think solves it. I think all we would do by starting earlier is would give us another half hour to go into the midnight hour, quite frankly. I don't think that limits our discussion. So it's either we are more brief in our comments or we have more meetings. 3 minutes.
I would just beg to differ. I think moving the meeting up by half an hour would make a difference. It means that it would now be 9:30, not 10 o'clock. And we would have covered this material, and we might feel differently about having the CEQA thing if we had that much more time. So, I mean, I think I don't recall. You guys tell me, when does the city council meeting start?
6?
They're at 6, and just on that point.
Yeah, and that's what we moved it up.
I'd love to have the consistency about it, so I don't have to think about it.
And it worked well. And we got stuff done, and we stopped at, I don't know, it's still 10 o'clock, is it? Or 10:30, what is it?
Well, they have the rule about not taking new items beyond 10:30, but again, I was just mentioning, it'd be great for me because I have to remember which meeting is which. We have other commissions that we kind of staff.
I mean, I'd be happy to start at 6 o'clock if the rest of the commission is willing to do that. We have people that are working.
I make a motion that all future planning commission meetings start at 6 p.m.
Starting.
Yeah. Yeah, you gotta try it again. I'm still on.
Oh, there we go. Wait, no, it's on there.
But his is out now.
We need a second. I'll second it.
Roll call, please.
Aye.
Commissioner O'Neill?
Yes.
Commissioner Willander?
Yes.
Commissioner Bohar?
Yes.
Commissioner Barbos?
Yes?
Commissioner Larry Barnett?
Yes.
And Chair Felder?
Yes.
Motion is unanimous.
Clarify, the motion was starting on May 9th.
Yes, sir. Can you just tell me that again for my own notes in case we lose the recording?
Further discussion?
I'd like to add something to that. I think the fact that we have never really talked about tightening up the meeting is meaningful. And I think just bringing it up on the agenda, talking about it, I think starting the meeting at 6 is a fine idea. But I think we should all think about it and perhaps have more discussion sometime, maybe even issue some guidelines on how we can tighten up the meetings. And I think if we had a target date of saying, look, we really want to wrap this up at 10 o'clock. I think if we're here at 6, we have 4 hours, and we have a target, we could be thinking a lot more effectively about tightening it up, trying to keep within, doing our business correctly, but keeping within that zone that we've agreed to. We've never really talked about it, and I think we're all adults, and we could probably I certainly could reduce my verbosity a lot and tighten up and think about how we could fit into that schedule.
Well, we do have a target on, currently, our target was 4 hours, so that we were supposed to be limiting ourselves to 10:30 if we started at 6:30. I say that at the beginning of every meeting.
Well, yeah, but we can take something on at 10:25.
Well, I just want to say that I think that because we're a deliberative body, I don't like the idea of saying, well, we're talking too much and we're thinking too much and we're exploring these ideas too much and we really ought to go faster and cut out what we have to say. I know no one's arguing for that, but I would rather be thorough to the point of maybe having to schedule an extra meeting from time to time than being too quick to make our decisions and not thoroughly exploring the issues that come before us.
I'm not suggesting that we aren't thorough. And I think we had a perfect example of what took place on Mockingbird in December and January. We had 4 meetings in the period of a month and a half because we kept continuing it because we needed more information and we didn't want to make a decision until we had everything. So we always have that option. And I just think that what I'm getting from the sense of this commission is that after you go for 4.5 hours, you get a little mentally fatigued and it's tough to do business at that point. That's all. So if we get to the point where we're not satisfied on making a decision, we'll continue it. Agreed? I think that concludes that item. Do we adjust that meeting time after 10 o'clock rather than 10:30 though?
Your call.
10. It was intended to be only a 4-hour period, so I don't think we have to amend the motion for that. With that, are there any issues, updates?
Yeah, I just have a few things. First thing I wanted to draw your attention to was the town hall meeting that's coming up, the first one in the series that we've been talking about. I would also like to ask you to look at the online survey that we have on our website and encourage people to participate in the survey on affordable housing. It's a very short survey that you can complete that we can kind of help inform folks on the first town hall that we're having. And again, it's April 25th at 6 o'clock to 8 p.m. over there at the Vintage House at Stone Hall, which is the hall at the very end, the most easterly portion of the building. So please feel free to invite your friends and participate in the survey.
Is that the 26th?
The 25th.
Is there any coordination with the county on this? Because about 4 hours ago, whenever we started, we heard from the Donald Street neighbors, and it's called Housing Our Community, and I always have viewed our community as Sonoma Valley, you know, the housing, this is one sort of economic area. I mean, is there any sort of...
The short answer is yes, and not only with the county, but with Sustainable Sonoma, you'll see the rollout of the community-wide concept.
Because they're doing a specific plan, we're updating our general plan, there's a UGB, you know, I feel like to make the most sense, everyone has to be sort of involved.
And I can speak to the spring specific plan to the extent that it was brought up within this discussion and not in items from the floor, that we are in communication with county staff regarding that regenerated process. So you'll be hearing more about it, not only in the press, but when they're actually soon to release the draft EIR that we'll be seeing probably at the same time as everybody else. I believe they're at the administrative draft stage as we speak. So that's 2 things out of my list of 6, and I'll try to make these things very short. And then the next thing is I do want to point out that in your planning magazine, which I hope you received, that there was an article in there called From Seed to Sale. So I'd like to pass that along.
I didn't get a magazine.
Well, part of your membership with APA is such that you should be getting a planning magazine. So if you've not got planning magazine, we need to get you signed up.
The April issue, I think I just received within the last week.
It just came in the mail, yeah. But we'll make sure, Steve, you haven't received magazine? So we may not have had you signed up yet because maybe that was the transition. I'm not sure. We'll check into that. But as members of the Planning Commission, we do get the ability to sign you up at a reduced rate. Actually, you know what? We did sign up all of the commissioners, so we'll check on the deliverable there. The interesting thing about this article is that it actually is pretty much Sonoma County centric. It's talking about some of the people that I've been meeting with at the county on other issues. So it's actually quite lengthy and discusses Sonoma County. So I think that will be of interest to you. Next, I do want to kind of show you, I'll pass out if you're interested in hooking up over the weekend at the conference in San Francisco. This is my particular schedule. So for those of you who will be attending that conference, you'll know where I'll be at. You'll see that I think 2 of them are on cannabis, so I'll be getting the national perspective of cannabis and how jurisdictions are regulating it. And you'll be able to see I'll only be there Saturday through Sunday, and so if there's issues with you commissioners with respect to your registration, your hotels, that kind of thing, I've put on there my cell number so you can get a hold of me. But I'll be there Saturday and Sunday, and I'll be coming back here for Monday and the city council meeting that night while staff attends the balance of the conference. One other thing is that we did receive an appeal of the Planning Commission's approval of a 2-lot subdivision from your March 14th meeting. It was the Classen subdivision, which is where the gentleman spoke about subdividing a little pie shape or a flag lot, if you will.
Yeah, the end of York Court.
On York Court, thank you. And the particular issue was the applicant appealed it, concerns about the Quimby fee calculation that we came up with. So that will be processed at some point in the future at the city council level or
I
other
didn't
options.
understand that the applicant appealed
His
A
approval.
unanimous vote to approve the project.
because.
The Quimby.
There was a
Because he didn't like
condition of
the condition.
approval required
Oh,
the payment
okay.
of a Quimby fee, and he has issue with that particular fee. Last thing, good news is that on the April 1st, we did submit our annual progress report with respect to housing, and we were one of 75% that filed it on a timely manner. That concludes my comments, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Comments from the commission?
Yes, real quick. I'm still curious. What's the status on Brazil housing lawsuit?
Brazil?
I mean, up on Brazil
mean,
Street.
Hillside?
Hillside.
No,
Brazil.
I understand the project, but there is no update for me to
There's no
provide.
update. What about the
Cheese factory?
well, the community, not the community, but the assisted living facility possibility on 2nd Street East? First Street, stand corrected. 1st Street East.
Yeah, we're awaiting an application on that.
Okay, and what about the sale of the Clydesdale Farm? Any update on that? Anything?
I have no
I have
update.
one. I mean, I'm on the board of the.
Just,
Please.
Just like to know.
We're still in negotiations. It's still, yeah.
Great. And then because the chairman abdicated his responsibilities the last time on small cell, I'm nervous about knowing when the next one is. So do we know when small cell is coming up again?
No, we don't. We're working with the applicants to refine a design that we can support as a staff. And we did get some extensions, John, till July on the commercials, on the 3 commercials, which by virtue of that extension extends out the residential dates.
And
if
then the mission project that we it was enacted and we thought it was, they claimed they were going to start moving on it, and all I've seen is survey stakes in the weeds. Any update on actually them doing something?
Mission Square, they're waiting for the rainy weather to be over to do grading.
Okay, thank you.
When you say small cell, you talking about cell towers?
Yeah, the small cell towers that we had one long commission meeting on, and they're coming back, as far as I know.
Verizon has an application.
Yeah, it's the Verizon applications, yes.
And the last one, Cheese Factory appeal is still going before city council?
Both are still pending, yes.
How about Gateway?
Oh, thank you, I see that. There's a fabric up on the chain link fence that now is obscuring some of the construction storage materials. Thank you, Mr. Storr, for your effectiveness in that.
As so directed by your commission.
If that's the final comments, I will look for a motion to adjourn.
Move we adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye.